The road to Moscow did not end in a single explosion. It froze. In June 1941, Germany hurled over 3 million soldiers into the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa. Army Group Center alone fielded roughly 1 million men, supported by more than 1,000 tanks and thousands of artillery pieces, firing shells weighing over 20 pounds each. The operational goal hardened quickly. Advance hundreds of miles east, encircle Soviet armies measured in the hundreds of thousands, and seize Moscow before winter recalibrated the climate into an enemy. The early months appeared to validate German assumptions. Encirclements at Minsk and Smolensk trapped Soviet forces in numbers exceeding 300,000 prisoners in single operations. Panzer divisions advanced at speeds measured in dozens of miles per day. Fuel convoys hauled hundreds of tons of gasoline forward. A single Panzer division could burn through over 100,000 gallons of fuel in sustained operations across a week. The Wehrmacht fractured Soviet front lines repeatedly, but maps deceive when distances stretch beyond rail gauge. The German logistical system relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. Over 600,000 horses accompanied the invasion force. Rail lines in Soviet territory used a broader gauge than German trains, requiring conversion across hundreds of miles before supplies could move efficiently. Trucks wore down, spare parts dwindled, engines clogged with dust during summer and then mud during autumn. Every additional mile east eroded supply cohesion. By October 1941, as Operation Typhoon began, the direct thrust toward Moscow, Army Group Center still fielded hundreds of thousands of men. Yet effective combat strength had already bled. Casualties across the Eastern Front by that stage exceeded several 100,000 killed and wounded. Tanks that had rolled confidently in June now required maintenance cycles measured in days rather than hours. Replacement parts did not arrive fast enough to match mechanical attrition. Inside a Panzer III advancing along a rutted road toward Vyazma, the crew felt the hull shudder as mud accumulated in the tracks. Autumn rains converted dirt roads into adhesive swamps. A vehicle weighing over 20 tons sank inches into soil. Engines strained. Fuel consumption increased as drivers throttled harder to maintain momentum. A stalled lead vehicle blocked the entire column. The offensive did not explode into defeat. It slowed. Soviet resistance recalibrated as well. Reserve armies formed east of Moscow. Factories beyond the Urals continued producing rifles, artillery, and tanks, measured in thousands per month. By late autumn, fresh Soviet divisions, some transferred from Siberia, entered defensive lines. These units carried winter equipment that German troops lacked. Temperatures dropped below freezing, lubricants thickened, rifle bolts froze, artillery recoil mechanisms stiffened. When I once spread German daily situation reports from late November 1941, besides Soviet mobilization data, what struck me was the compression of time. German commanders believed they were weeks from decisive collapse of Soviet resistance. Yet Soviet manpower reserves and industrial relocation east of the Urals had already recalibrated the equation. The assumption of rapid Soviet breakdown eroded faster than German planners recognized. German forces reached positions within sight of Moscow's outer defenses. In some sectors, forward patrols reported glimpses of distant structures through binoculars. But proximity does not equal control. German divisions reported infantry companies reduced to half strength. Some units recorded casualty rates exceeding 30% over the campaign's course. Winter clothing shortages intensified exposure casualties. Frostbite cases numbered in the thousands. Artillery still fired. Tanks still advanced in limited thrusts, but fuel deliveries lagged. A single armored regiment required hundreds of tons of fuel and ammunition weekly to sustain offensive action. Rail conversion delays meant that supplies arrived in irregular pulses. Horses collapsed under strain. Trucks broke axles in frozen ruts. Then the Soviet counteroffensive began in early December 1941. Fresh Soviet formations attacked across a broad front. German units, already stretched thin, collided with renewed pressure. Temperatures plunged further, in some areas below -20 degrees Celsius. Machine gun mechanisms seized. Diesel engines required external fires beneath oil pans to restart. The Wehrmacht, structured for rapid summer warfare, confronted a climate that fractured its mechanical reliability. Inside a foxhole outside Moscow, a German infantryman felt the ground hard as iron beneath him. Breath crystallized instantly. Ammunition pouches stiffened. The vibration of distant artillery traveled through frozen earth. Soviet units advanced in waves, supported by tanks whose crews had insulated engines for winter operation. The German line did not shatter in a single day, but it bent backward under sustained force. Strategically, Germany lost the Battle of Moscow because it overextended logistics, underestimated Soviet manpower and industrial capacity, and failed to secure decisive victory before winter. The initial encirclements, though enormous, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, did not annihilate the Soviet Union's ability to field new armies. Industrial relocation moved entire factories eastward, machinery weighing dozens of tons transported by rail before German forces could overrun them. By January 1942, German forces had been pushed back from Moscow's outskirts. The offensive that began in June with sweeping encirclements had stalled in snow and ice. Casualties across the Eastern Front climbed into the millions for both sides by early 1942. German expectations of swift victory fractured irreversibly. It is important to understand this was not a single catastrophic collapse like Stalingrad would later become. It was a grinding erosion. The Wehrmacht collided with geography measured in thousands of miles, rail gauges incompatible with its trains, winter temperatures hostile to its machinery, and a Soviet state willing to expend manpower in numbers that recalibrated loss tolerance. If you are listening now, perhaps as the room grows still, imagine a long column of armored vehicles halted in snow, engines idling unevenly, exhaust drifting into freezing air. Somewhere ahead lies a city whose lights flicker faintly through winter haze. The distance between sight and seizure stretches wider than the map suggested. The cold settles into steel. The advance slows, then stops. This is the entire history of why Germany lost the Battle of Moscow. Chapter 1. The Weight of a Railway Sleeper. The 8th of August 1941, somewhere in the rear area of Army Group Center, a German railway engineer battalion is working through its second month of what should have been a straightforward conversion job. The men are respiking rail, pulling up one line of track, shifting it inward by 89 millimeters, and hammering it back down onto ties that weren't designed for it. 89 millimeters. That's less than the width of a man's palm. It's the difference between the Russian broad gauge at 1,520 millimeters and the European standard gauge at 1,435. And on this particular morning, a report is being compiled for General der Eisenbahn Pioniere Otto Willy, stating that some 16,148 kilometers of Soviet track have been converted to German gauge since the invasion began. The number sounds enormous. It sounds like progress. But someone on the receiving end of that report, likely a staff officer in the Quartermaster General's section, we don't know exactly who, has scribbled 2 words in pencil in the margin of the logistics summary. The words are, noch nicht genug, still not enough. The annotation is unsigned, and it may be the most honest assessment of Germany's entire Eastern campaign, written in 1941. I want to begin this story here, in the rail yards, because the Battle of Moscow is almost never told from this angle. The popular version starts with panzers and snow, with frozen engines and generals squinting through field glasses at the distant spires of the Kremlin. Those images are real. They happened. But they are the end of a chain of failure, not the beginning. The beginning is here, in the mathematics of gauge conversion, in the throughput capacity of a single-track railway junction west of Smolensk, in the gap between what the German army needed delivered every day and what the converted rail network could actually carry. Before the first snows of 1941, before the autumn mud, before Zhukov took command of the Western Front, the outcome of the Battle of Moscow was being written in railway timetables, and it was being written by men with grease under their fingernails, not by men with maps on their walls. The gauge problem wasn't a footnote to the campaign. It was the campaign, experienced at its most fundamental level. The level of iron, timber, and arithmetic. The arithmetic was brutal, and it was simple. Army Group Center, the force tasked with taking Moscow, required a minimum daily throughput of roughly 27 train loads to sustain offensive operations. Each train carried approximately 450 tons of supplies: ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, medical equipment, replacement personnel. That's a daily requirement of just over 12,000 tons. By late September 1941, the converted railhead at Smolensk, the farthest point east where German gauge trains could operate, could handle approximately 18 trains per day. Not 27, 18. The deficit was 9 trains, or roughly 4,050 tons, every single day. And this deficit didn't sit still, it compounded. Every day that the front advanced further east from Smolensk, the gap between the railhead and the fighting troops widened, and the truck columns that had to bridge that gap consumed fuel that was itself part of the cargo they were hauling forward. This is the logistical death spiral that military planners call the tyranny of distance, and it was already spinning by the time Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow, was ordered on the 2nd of October. The rail conversion process itself deserves more attention than it typically receives, because understanding why it was so slow explains why the supply deficit existed. The job wasn't just about moving one rail 89 millimeters inward. Soviet railway ties were spaced at different intervals than German ones, meaning the re-gauged track sat unevenly and couldn't support heavy traffic at speed. Soviet water towers, which locomotives needed to refill their boilers every 100 kilometers or so, were placed at intervals calibrated for Soviet engines with different boiler capacities. German locomotives ran dry between them. Soviet signal systems were electrically incompatible with German rolling stock. Even the station platforms were built to a different height, so loading and unloading was awkward and slow. What the Germans called gauge conversion was, in practice, the reconstruction of an entire railway infrastructure from the ground up. Every switch, every signal, every watering point, while operating under intermittent Soviet air attack and increasingly effective partisan sabotage. A railway battalion could convert about 20 kilometers of track per day, with roughly 200 men working. That sounds reasonable until you realize the distance from the pre-war Soviet border to Moscow is approximately 1,000 kilometers, and every kilometer of converted track behind you needed to be maintained, repaired, and defended. There's a critical detail that often gets lost in the larger narrative, and it has to do with the Soviet side of this equation. The Soviets didn't simply retreat and leave their railway network behind for the Germans to use. They destroyed it, systematically. Station buildings were blown. Bridges were dropped, rail was torn up, or, more cleverly, left in place but sabotaged. A rail with a hairline crack from a controlled explosive charge looks intact until a locomotive passes over it at speed, at which point it fails catastrophically. Water towers were filled with concrete or poisoned. Turntables were wrecked. This wasn't the ad hoc destruction of a panicking army. It was the execution of a deliberate scorched earth railway denial doctrine. And the German planning staffs had catastrophically underweighted it. The pre-invasion logistics estimates, compiled by Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner's office, had projected that the railhead could keep pace with the advancing front at a distance of roughly 300 kilometers. By August, Halder's diary entries, Franz Halder being the chief of the German General Staff, were recording with growing alarm that the gap had widened to 500 kilometers or more. There's a genuine source conflict here. Did Wagner's staff knowingly provide optimistic estimates to avoid delaying the invasion, or did the scale of Soviet railway destruction genuinely exceed all reasonable planning assumptions? The archives don't give a clean answer. Both explanations probably contain some truth. When I was working through the quartermaster reports cross-referenced with the Army Group Center War Diary entries from September and October 1941, I found it striking how early the language of the logistics officers shifts from optimism to something approaching quiet panic. By mid-September, the reports aren't discussing how to support the advance. They're discussing which elements of the advance can be supported and which must be abandoned. There's a supply depot established at Roslavel in early October that illustrates the problem in miniature. It can stockpile enough ammunition, fuel, and rations for approximately 8 days of offensive operations. The minimum required for a sustained push to Moscow was 20 days' worth. The depot exists, it functions, it is 8 days short of adequate, and yet the offensive is ordered anyway. The decision to launch Operation Typhoon on the 2nd of October, 1941, was made in the full knowledge, or at least the full availability of knowledge, that the logistical base was insufficient. This is the point where logistics crosses over into psychology, where the mathematics of supply intersect with the institutional inability of the German High Command to accept what the mathematics were telling them. The trains were running, they just weren't running enough, and the gap between running and enough was 4,050 tons per day, invisible on a battle map, inescapable on the ground. The motor transport situation compounds the picture. Army Group Center began Barbarossa with roughly 14,000 trucks in its gross transport realm. the long-haul motor transport columns responsible for bridging the gap between the railhead and the fighting front. By late September, operational rates had fallen below 40%. This wasn't primarily due to enemy action. The roads did it. Soviet roads west of Moscow were, with one notable exception, the Minsk-Moscow highway, unpaved tracks through forest and steppe that turned to dust in summer and soup in autumn. The standard Wehrmacht 3-ton Opel Blitz truck was rear-wheel drive, designed for the metalled roads of Western Europe. On Russian tracks, axles broke, suspensions failed, tires wore through in days. Over 200,000 German vehicles had been lost across all sectors of the Eastern Front by the time of Operation Typhoon, a staggering figure that includes thousands of irreplaceable trucks. The replacements being sent from Germany were largely two-wheel drive models, functionally useless off paved surfaces. The Wehrmacht was feeding trucks into Russia the way a furnace consumes coal, steadily, irreversibly, and with diminishing returns. It strikes me that most histories of the Battle of Moscow fixate on the final 29 kilometers, the distance between the closest German approach at Krasnaya Polyana and the Kremlin. 29 kilometers. In a modern car, that's a 40-minute drive in traffic. It sounds so close. It invites the reader to imagine a near miss, a what-if, a counterfactual where one more push might have done it. But the 29 kilometers were never the problem. The problem was the roughly 4,050 missing tons per day at Smolensk, multiplied by weeks, compounded by mud and distance and destruction. The 29 kilometers were the symptom. The 4,050 tons were the disease. And the disease was diagnosed, in pencil, unsigned, in the margin of a logistics summary, on the 8th of August, 1941. Noch nicht genug. Still not enough. It was never going to be enough. The broader picture is this. Germany invaded the Soviet Union with a logistics system designed for a short war. The rail conversion program assumed the campaign would be decided within the first 8 to 12 weeks, before the supply lines were stretched to breaking. The truck fleet assumed decent roads. The spare parts pipeline assumed low attrition. Every one of these assumptions was wrong, and they were wrong not because of bad luck, but because the planning was built on a foundation of institutional optimism that refused to engage with the scale of the undertaking. The Soviet Union was not France. The distances were continental. The infrastructure was primitive or actively destroyed. The enemy did not collapse on schedule. And the German logistics system, which had brilliantly supported the 6-week conquest of France in 1940, simply could not scale to support a 6-month campaign across a landmass that stretched from the Bug River to the Ural Mountains. The Battle of Moscow was lost, in a meaningful sense, before it was fought. Lost in the gap between what the planners assumed and what the railways delivered, between the trains that were needed and the trains that arrived. Everything that follows in this story, the mud, the cold, the Soviet counteroffensive, is built on this foundation of logistical insolvency. There is a concept in modern supply chain management called last-mile logistics, the idea that the final segment of any delivery route is disproportionately expensive and disproportionately likely to fail. Amazon warehouses grapple with it. Ukrainian forces managing drone resupply in the Donbass grapple with it. The Wehrmacht grappled with it in 1941, in the most consequential version of the problem ever attempted. The last mile from Smolensk to the Moscow front was, in truth, the last several hundred miles, bridged by broken trucks on dissolving roads, carrying loads that were never large enough, arriving at a front that consumed supplies faster than any railway could deliver them. The margin annotation at the quartermaster's office, still not enough, wasn't a complaint. It was a prophecy. And the man who wrote it didn't even bother to sign his name. Chapter 2, Directive Number 35 and the Argument Nobody Won. The 21st of August, 1941, at the Führer's headquarters in East Prussia, a decision is made that will reverberate through the next 4 months of the war and through the next 80 years of historical argument. Adolf Hitler orders Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, the most powerful mobile striking force in Army Group Center, to turn south, away from Moscow, and drive toward Kiev to encircle the Soviet armies in Ukraine. The order contradicts the urgent advice of Franz Halder, the chief of the General Staff, and Fedor von Bock, the commander of Army Group Center. Both men want Moscow. Both men have argued, in person and in writing, that Moscow is the decisive objective, and that diverting forces south will squander the narrow window of good weather remaining before autumn. Hitler disagrees. He wants the grain of Ukraine and the industry of the Donbass. He has told his generals that Moscow is of no great importance, and that victory will come from destroying Soviet armies in the field, not from capturing capitals. The argument has been ongoing for weeks. It hasn't been resolved. It has been overridden. And that distinction between a decision reached by consensus and a decision imposed by authority will define everything that follows. Halder's diary is the closest thing we have to an interior view of this command crisis. And it's a fascinating document, not just for what it says, but for how it looks on the page. Halder was a meticulous man, a Bavarian artillerist, trained in the general staff tradition of precise, unemotional record-keeping. His diary entries are typically controlled, analytical, measured. But the entry for the 11th of August, 1941, 10 days before the final Kiev order, contains something unusual, a rare exclamation mark, placed beside a notation about Hitler's preference for the southern diversion. On the facing page, a force ratio calculation has been underlined 3 times. In 80 years of Halder scholarship, that exclamation mark has attracted surprisingly little attention. But to me, it speaks volumes. This is a man who is trained never to show emotion in official documents, and he cannot help himself. The exclamation mark is a crack in the professional mask, a single punctuation mark that encodes weeks of frustration, institutional conflict, and the growing awareness that the professional military judgment of the general staff is being overruled by a political leader who trusts his own instincts over their training. The argument over Moscow versus Kiev was not a simple binary. It was a 3-way collision between strategic logic, political ambition, and operational reality, and the archival record presents at least 3 different versions of the key confrontations. The first version comes from Guderian's post-war memoir, Panzer Leader, published in 1952. In it, Guderian presents himself as a vigorous advocate for Moscow, who was overruled by an obstinate Hitler. The second version comes from Halder's diary, which suggests that when Guderian was actually in the room with Hitler on the 19th of August, he was considerably more compliant than his memoir later claimed, that he accepted the Kiev order without the dramatic resistance he later described. The third version comes from Bach's war diary, which notes that Guderian seemed resigned after the meeting, a word that implies neither vigorous resistance nor enthusiastic compliance, but rather the weary acceptance of a man who knows the argument is lost. 3 primary sources, 3 versions of the same man in the same room on the same day. This is what working with historical archives actually looks like, not a clean narrative with heroes and villains, but a tangle of conflicting accounts, written by men who each had reason to present themselves in a particular light. Guderian wanted to be remembered as a man who fought for the right strategy. Halder wanted to be remembered as the professional who was ignored. Bach wanted to be remembered as the pragmatist who saw both sides. None of them were lying exactly, but none of them were telling the whole truth either. The Kiev diversion was, by any tactical measure, a staggering success. Guderian's Panzer Group drove south, linked up with Army Group South's forces, and closed the encirclement around Kiev on the 16th of September, 1941. The result was the largest single encirclement in military history, 665,000 Soviet soldiers captured, along with 884 tanks and over 3,500 guns. The numbers are almost beyond comprehension. 665,000 men. That's more than the entire population of a mid-sized European city, marching into captivity in a single operation. The German propaganda machine celebrated it as proof of inevitable victory. Hitler was vindicated. The generals who had opposed the diversion were, temporarily, silenced. But the celebration obscured a cost that wouldn't become apparent for weeks. The cost in time, fuel, mechanical wear, and the irreplaceable narrowing of the seasonal window for operations against Moscow. Every kilometer Guderian's tanks drove south was a kilometer they'd have to drive north again to get back into position for the Moscow offensive. Every ton of fuel burned on the road to Kiev was a ton that wouldn't be available for Operation Typhoon. Every hour of engine life consumed on the march was an hour that the Maybach HL-120TRM power plant of a Panzer III wouldn't have when it mattered most. The mechanical arithmetic is worth pausing on, because it connects directly to the story we told in the previous chapter about logistics, and it foreshadows the crisis we'll examine in the next chapter about tank readiness. A Panzer III's engine, the Maybach HL-120TRM, a 12-cylinder gasoline engine producing approximately 300 horsepower, had an average operational lifespan of roughly 1,500 kilometers before requiring major overhaul. That's not 1,500 kilometers of combat, that's 1,500 kilometers of running, including road marches, which constituted the majority of an engine's life. The round trip from Army Group Center's sector to Kiev and back was, depending on the specific route, somewhere between 600 and 800 kilometers. That's a substantial percentage of the engine's total overhaul interval consumed on a strategic diversion, not advancing toward the campaign's primary objective, but driving sideways and then back again. When Guderian's Panzer Group finally reversed course and headed north for Operation Typhoon in late September, many of his tanks were running on engines that were halfway to their overhaul limit or beyond. The tanks didn't know about strategic arguments or command disputes. They simply had fewer hours of reliable life remaining, and those missing hours would make themselves felt, with increasing urgency, in the frozen approaches to Moscow. To me, the most significant consequence of the Kiev decision isn't the tactical result or even the mechanical cost, it's the calendar. Operation Typhoon was launched on the 2nd of October, 1941. Had the Kiev diversion never happened, a drive on Moscow could conceivably have begun in late August. The difference is 5 weeks. 5 weeks doesn't sound like much, but in the specific climatic conditions of central Russia in autumn, 5 weeks is the difference between operating on dry, hard ground and operating in the Rasputitsa, the season of mud that arrives in October and transforms the unpaved road network into an impassable morass. The Rasputitsa is not a surprise. It happens every year, as predictable as the seasons that cause it. A late August offensive would have had roughly 6 to 8 weeks of operational weather before the mud arrived. An early October offensive, which is what Typhoon actually was, had approximately 1 week before the mud began and perhaps 3 weeks of usable conditions in total before the ground froze in November. Every one of those lost 5 weeks was spent in Ukraine, achieving a tactical victory of enormous scale and essentially zero strategic relevance to the question of whether Moscow would fall. This is the core of the historiographical debate. Did the Kiev diversion cause the failure at Moscow, or was Moscow going to fail regardless? I lean toward the view that the diversion was a significant accelerant of an outcome that was likely for structural reasons. The logistics were already failing, the Wehrmacht was already overstretched. But the 5 weeks mattered, the calendar mattered, and the fact that Typhoon launched into the teeth of the Rasputitsa rather than ahead of it is a consequence of a decision made in August, not a consequence of bad luck in October. Directive number 35, issued on the 6th of September 1941, formally designated Moscow as the next objective and authorized the concentration of forces for what would become Operation Typhoon. Reading the directive's text, one is struck by its confident language, the assumption that the forces available are sufficient, that the enemy is on the verge of collapse, that the operation needs only to be organized and coordinated for success to follow. There is no hedging language, no contingency planning for failure, no acknowledgement that the forces being assembled for Typhoon are the same forces that have been fighting without rest since June and are now significantly degraded in manpower, equipment, and morale. The directive reads, in other words, like a document written by men who have already decided on the conclusion and are working backward to justify it. This is not unique to the German High Command of 1941. It's a recognizable pattern in institutional decision-making, the tendency to commit to a course of action because the alternative is admitting that the original plan has failed. In modern decision theory, it's called the sunk cost fallacy, the irrational commitment to a failing strategy because of what's already been invested, rather than a clear-eyed assessment of what's still achievable. The German command had invested 3 months, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and the operational life of thousands of vehicles in Barbarossa. Admitting that Moscow was beyond reach would have meant admitting that the entire campaign was failing. And so the directive was issued, the forces were concentrated, and Operation Typhoon was launched. Not from strategic confidence, but from strategic exhaustion, because attacking Moscow was the only remaining option that didn't require confronting the truth. I find myself returning, again and again, to the contrast between the Kiev victory and its strategic consequences. 665,000 prisoners, nearly 900 tanks captured. The numbers are extraordinary. They represent a military achievement without precedent, and they were, in the cold calculus of the campaign, largely irrelevant to the question that mattered: whether Army Group Center had the strength, the supply, and the time to take Moscow before winter. The Soviet Union could absorb the loss of 665,000 men. It could not absorb the loss of Moscow without severe consequences. The city was the hub of the Soviet rail network, the administrative center of the government, the symbolic heart of the regime. But the forces needed to take Moscow had just spent 5 weeks taking Kiev instead. The sunk cost fallacy doesn't just apply to decisions, it applies to resources. The fuel burned, the engines worn, the weeks lost. These were costs that could never be recovered, invested in an objective that, however impressive, didn't bring Germany 1 kilometer closer to ending the war. Kiev was a victory. It was also, in a sense, I think the archive's support, a form of strategic self-harm. The personal dimension of this story is easy to overlook amid the strategic arguments, but it matters. Halder, Bach, and Guderian were not abstract decision-making nodes. They were men in a command culture that demanded obedience to the supreme commander, while simultaneously valuing professional military expertise. The tension between these two imperatives, obey the Führer, but also apply professional judgment, produced a kind of institutional paralysis that manifested as compliance disguised as agreement. Halder opposed the Kiev diversion in his diary, but implemented it without formal protest. Guderian opposed it in his memoirs, but accepted it in the meeting. Bach opposed it in principle, but executed it in practice. No one resigned. No one refused. No one forced the crisis to a resolution. The argument wasn't lost by the generals. It was abandoned by them. Surrendered in the face of authority they lacked the institutional courage to challenge. And the consequences of that surrender, 5 weeks, several hundred kilometers of unnecessary engine wear, a campaign launched into the wrong season, would be paid not by the men who made the decisions, but by the men who carried them out, in the mud and cold of the Moscow approaches. The parallel to modern strategic decision-making is uncomfortable but unavoidable. The sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to double down on failing strategies because of prior investment, is now a recognized cognitive bias taught in war colleges, business schools, and government leadership programs worldwide. The case study most frequently cited is, in various forms, the Eastern Front of 1941, though the specific lessons drawn depend heavily on who is teaching and what institutional failures they wish to highlight. The deeper lesson, to me, isn't about any single decision. It's about command cultures that cannot process bad news, institutions that punish honest assessment and reward confident prediction, and the specific danger of a system where strategic debate is resolved not by evidence but by authority. The argument over Moscow versus Kiev was never settled on its merits. It was settled by power. And the city that would pay the price for that settlement was neither Kiev nor Moscow, but rather the thousands of small, unrecorded places between them, where German soldiers, riding in tanks with increasingly worn engines, advanced toward an objective their supply lines could not sustain. Directive number 35 was not a plan. It was a hope, dressed in the language of command. And hope, as any logistician will tell you, is not a method of supply. Chapter 3. 1,535 tanks and a confidence problem. The 1st of October, 1941, somewhere in the maintenance area of a Panzer division belonging to Army Group Center, a Werkstatt Company officer, a workshop company commander, is completing a vehicle status report. The form requires him to classify every tank in his unit's inventory by readiness condition. The categories are blunt. Klar means combat ready. Kurs means the vehicle needs short-term repair, a day or two, something the field workshop can handle. Lang means long-term repair. The tank needs to go back to a rear area depot if a rear area depot can be found. Verlust means total loss, burned out, drowned in a river crossing, destroyed by enemy fire, or simply broken beyond any reasonable prospect of repair. The officer works through his list, tank by tank, serial number by serial number. One entry catches the eye, a Panzer III Ausf J, listed as Klar, combat ready. But beside the serial number, in handwriting that suggests haste rather than carelessness, someone has added a note. Motor läuft unregelmäßig. The engine is running irregularly. This tank is counted as operational. It will be included in the strength figures that flow upward from the division to the Panzer Group, from the Panzer Group to Army Group Center, from Army Group Center to OKH in East Prussia. By the time the number reaches Halder's desk, it will be clean and precise, a figure showing how many tanks Army Group Center possesses for Operation Typhoon. The handwritten note will not be included. The irregular engine will not appear in the briefing. The number that emerges from this aggregation process, the total operational tank strength of Army Group Center on the eve of Operation Typhoon, is approximately 1,535. This figure, compiled and cross-referenced by the historian David Stahel, drawing on Panzer Group strength returns, and corroborated by independent analysis of the same source materials, is considerably lower than the figures commonly encountered in popular histories of the battle. The discrepancy exists because popular histories frequently cite total tank holdings. Every tank assigned to Army Group Center, including those in long-term repair, those awaiting spare parts, and those that exist only as administrative entries in a unit's table of organization. The operational number, the tanks that could actually move, shoot, and fight on the morning of the 2nd of October, was roughly 1,535. And even that number, as the story of the Panzer III with the irregular engine suggests, was probably an overcount. Nobody was incentivized to underreport readiness. Every unit commander wanted his formation to look as strong as possible on paper, because paper strength determined the missions you received and the resources you were allocated. The institutional pressure was always toward optimism. The tanks didn't share this optimism. They simply ran, or they didn't. The distribution of this force across the 4 panzer groups assigned to Army Group Center was deeply uneven, and the unevenness itself tells a story about the preceding months of campaigning. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, the force that had just completed the long round trip to Kiev and back, was the worst affected. Some of his panzer battalions reported tank strengths at 30 to 35% of their established strength. That means a battalion authorized, say, 50 tanks, might have 17 or 18 actually running. And running, in this context, includes vehicles like our Panzer III with the irregular engine, machines that were technically mobile, but whose reliability in sustained combat operations was questionable at best. The other panzer groups were in better shape, but better is a relative term that obscures how far below full strength the entire armored force had fallen. Army Group Center was about to launch the most important offensive of the campaign, with a tank force that was, at best, operating at somewhere between 50 and 65% of its paper establishment. And even that estimate may be generous once you account for the vehicles that were klar in name, but limping in practice. Understanding why requires getting into the mechanical details, and this is where the story becomes, for me, genuinely interesting, because the failure of Operation Typhoon was not just a story of grand strategy gone wrong, but a story of specific metal parts wearing out under specific physical conditions. Take the transmission of the Panzer III Ausf J, the ZF SSG-77, a 6-speed synchro-mesh gearbox manufactured by Zahnradfabrik Friedrichshafen. This was a well-engineered component by the standards of 1941, designed for the metalled roads and moderate distances of Western European warfare. The synchromesh mechanism, a set of brass or bronze cones that equalize the rotational speed of the gears before engagement, allowing smooth shifting without double clutching, was the transmission's critical vulnerability. On Russian roads, the combination of uneven surfaces, constant low-gear operation through mud and sand, and extreme temperature differentials between day and night caused accelerated wear on these synchromesh cones. When the cones wore past their tolerance, the gears could no longer be engaged smoothly. The driver had to force shifts, which damaged the gear teeth. Within a few hundred kilometers of this degraded operation, the transmission would begin jumping out of gear under load, a failure mode that meant the tank could not reliably maintain a selected gear while crossing rough terrain or climbing a slope. It was technically operational. It was practically crippled in any combat maneuvering more demanding than straight-line driving on a flat surface. And there were no replacement synchromesh cones available anywhere east of Warsaw by October 1941. The spare parts crisis was not a peripheral issue. It was the central mechanical fact of the German Panzer Force in autumn 1941. A single Panzer III required approximately 2.5 tons of spare parts per month during sustained offensive operations, Not battle damage repairs, just routine maintenance. Track links, road wheels, engine filters, gaskets, electrical components, and yes, transmission parts. Multiply that by roughly 800 operational Panzer IIIs in Army Group Center, and you get a monthly spare parts requirement of approximately 2,000 tons. 2,000 tons of precisely machined, model-specific components that had to be manufactured in Germany, shipped east by rail to the overburdened Smolensk railhead, and then trucked forward over the same disintegrating roads that were destroying the trucks carrying them. The spare parts were competing for rail capacity with ammunition, fuel, food, and every other category of supply, on a rail network that was already, as we discussed in the previous chapter, running 9 trains per day below minimum requirements. The tanks were not just fighting the Red Army, they were fighting their own supply chain. When I was cross-referencing the Panzer Group strength returns with the quartermaster reports for October 1941, I found it striking how little attention the operational histories give to this mechanical dimension. The memoirs of the German generals, Guderian, Hoth, Reinhardt, consistently attribute Typhoon's failure to 2 external factors: the weather and Soviet numerical superiority. The weather was real. Soviet numbers were real. But the maintenance logs tell a different story, one that is considerably less flattering to the generals themselves. The tanks were already failing before the cold arrived. The spare parts were already absent before the mud season. The engine hours were already consumed before the first frost. The weather didn't break the Panzer force. It broke a Panzer force that was already half broken. The distinction matters because it shifts the question of responsibility. If the weather is to blame, then no German decision-maker bears accountability. They were defeated by an act of God. If the mechanical degradation is to blame, then every commander who pushed forward with tanks running on worn transmissions and engines past their overhaul intervals shares responsibility for the outcome. The memoirs, not surprisingly, prefer the weather explanation. The maintenance logs prefer the other one. There is one moment in early October that crystallizes the mechanical crisis in a way that no amount of aggregate statistics can match. On the 6th through 8th of October, 1941, near the town of Mtsensk, roughly 300 kilometers south of Moscow, elements of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army encountered Soviet Colonel Dmitry Katakov's 4th Tank Brigade, equipped with T-34 tanks. The engagement was, by the standards of the Eastern Front, a relatively small action, but its impact on German thinking was enormous. German 37mm anti-tank rounds, the standard anti-armor weapon of many German infantry formations, bounced off the T-34's sloped armor without penetrating. The T-34's 76.2mm gun could destroy German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs at ranges where the German tanks' guns were ineffective in return. Guderian personally reported to OKH that the Panzer III and Panzer IV were qualitatively inferior to the T-34, and he recommended that a German delegation be sent to examine captured T-34s to inform the design of a new German tank. This recommendation was acted upon, and the analysis that resulted directly influenced the development of what would become the Panther tank. The war's future course was shaped, in part, by a handful of engagements in a muddy field near an obscure Russian town. The Mtsensk encounter was not merely a tactical shock, it was an existential challenge to German armored warfare doctrine, which assumed qualitative superiority of German equipment over Soviet equipment. That assumption had been largely accurate in June 1941, when the bulk of the Soviet tank fleet consisted of obsolescent BT series and T-26 light tanks. The T-34 had existed before the invasion, but the Germans had not encountered it in significant numbers or in competently handled formations until Katakov's brigade demonstrated what it could do. The T-34's combination of sloped armor, which effectively increased the armor's resistance to penetration by presenting incoming rounds with a deflection angle, a powerful diesel engine producing 500 horsepower for a vehicle weighing roughly 26.5 tons, and wide tracks that distributed its ground pressure more effectively than German tanks on soft ground, made it, in the autumn of 1941, arguably the best medium tank in the world. The Germans were advancing on Moscow with Panzer IIIs, whose transmissions were failing and whose guns could not penetrate the frontal armor of the best Soviet tank. This is not a combination that inspires confidence. The confidence problem was not just mechanical, it was institutional. The question that hangs over Army Group Center's leadership in early October 1941 is this. Given that the tank force was at 50 to 65% operational strength, given that spare parts were unavailable, given that the logistical system was already 9 trains per day short of requirements, given that the weather window was closing, why did they attack? The answer, I believe, is not stupidity or ignorance. The generals knew the numbers, they had the reports, they had the strength returns with their Klar and Kurz and Lang and Verlust columns. They pushed forward anyway because the institutional culture of the German officer corps in 1941 made it psychologically impossible to advocate for stopping. To recommend halting the offensive was to admit that the campaign was failing, and to admit that the campaign was failing was to challenge the foundational assumption of the entire war, that the Wehrmacht was invincible, that the Soviet Union would collapse under the first serious blow, that the Blitzkrieg model that had conquered France in 6 weeks could conquer Russia in 6 months. The tanks couldn't support this assumption. The spare parts couldn't support it. The supply lines couldn't support it. But the culture demanded it. And so 1,535 tanks, some of them running with irregular engines, some of them missing synchromesh cones, some of them one hard shift away from a breakdown that would leave them stranded on a Russian road with no prospect of repair, were ordered forward toward Moscow. The gap between operational readiness and paper strength, between what you own and what you can fight with, is not a historical curiosity. It is a live controversy in modern defense procurement. NATO nations in 2026 routinely report fleet sizes for their major weapons platforms, total numbers of tanks, aircraft, and infantry fighting vehicles in their inventories, while operational readiness rates for those same platforms remain contentiously, and sometimes embarrassingly, below target. The German Puma infantry fighting vehicle program has faced persistent readiness questions. The American F-35 program has struggled with maintenance costs and availability rates. The principle is the same in every case. The number that matters is not how many you have, but how many you can put into the fight on a given day, with trained crews and adequate ammunition and functioning systems. In October 1941, the number that mattered was 1,535, and even that number was probably a lie, told by institutions that could not afford the truth. The maintenance officer who wrote "Motor läuft unregelmäßig" beside that serial number knew the truth, but his truth didn't make it into the briefing. It rarely does. Chapter 4. Letters Home from a Man Who Knew. The 16th of December, 1941, somewhere in the field headquarters of the 2nd Panzer Army, a headquarters that is, on this date, in the process of being abandoned, Heinz Guderian sits down to write a letter to his wife, Marguerite. It is his last letter from the campaign. Within days, he will be relieved of command, dismissed by Hitler for ordering unauthorized retreats. He doesn't know this yet, or perhaps he senses it. The tone of the letter suggests a man who is already composing an account for posterity, even as he writes to his spouse. The letter is written on field stationery. The handwriting, according to the historian David Stahel, who published these letters in the Journal of Slavic Military Studies in 2025, shows signs of haste and fatigue. Guderian laments, in Stahel's summary, all that has gone wrong since the early success of Operation Typhoon. The sentence structure is not that of a confident general drafting a confident dispatch. It is the syntax of a man trying to explain, to the one person who might still listen without judgment, how everything fell apart. I want to slow the pace of this story down considerably for this chapter, because we've spent 3 chapters buried in railway gauges and transmission specifications and tonnage deficits, and the danger of that approach, necessary as it is that it can reduce the Battle of Moscow to a problem of engineering. It wasn't only that. It was also a human event, experienced by specific individuals who wrote letters, kept diaries, felt fear and cold and frustration, and occasionally something that might be called despair. Guderian's private letters, published by Stahel, provide a window into this human dimension that his famous post-war memoir, Panzer Leader, first published in 1952 and read by millions, deliberately obscures. The memoir is a polished, self-serving narrative of a brilliant commander constrained by an incompetent supreme leader. The letters are something else entirely. They are the unedited voice of a man in real time, writing to the person he trusts most, saying things he would never say in an official report or a published book. The gap between the two, between the private letters and the public memoir, is to me one of the most revealing archival discoveries in recent Eastern Front scholarship. The letters span the period from October to December 1941, the entire arc of Operation Typhoon. In early October, the tone is cautiously optimistic. Guderian writes of the initial success of the offensive, the encirclement at Bryansk, the rapid advance. But even in these early letters, there are notes of concern that don't appear in the memoir. He mentions the toll on vehicles and men. He acknowledges difficulties that the memoir would later attribute entirely to external forces, weather, terrain, Soviet numbers, but that the letters suggest he understood were also consequences of his own force's exhaustion. The letters are not dramatic confessions. They are the observations of a professional soldier, writing to his wife with the assumption that no one else will read them. Their power comes from their ordinariness, the way concerns about supply shortages sit alongside inquiries about family matters, the way operational anxieties are sandwiched between domestic trivialities. War, in private correspondence, is never just war. It's also the life continuing around it, the mundane persistence of personal concerns amid institutional catastrophe. By mid-October, the mood shifts perceptibly. The letters begin recording cold, supply shortages, and the exhaustion of his Panzer divisions in language that grows progressively bleaker. The specifics that Stahl draws out are precisely the kind of details that Guderian's memoir smooths over or omits entirely. The memoir presents Typhoon as a heroic campaign, undermined by forces beyond any general's control. The letters present it as a campaign that the general himself increasingly doubted, conducted with forces he privately acknowledged were insufficient, toward an objective he was less and less certain could be achieved. The dissonance between these two accounts, the public memoir and the private correspondence, raises an uncomfortable question that I don't think has been adequately addressed in the historiography. If Guderian knew the offensive was failing, privately, in his letters to his wife, why did he continue to issue orders advancing it? Was he hoping for a miracle? Was he unable, within the command culture of the Wehrmacht, to be the general who recommended stopping? Or was there a colder calculation, the awareness that his career depended on pressing forward, that the general who halts an offensive invites blame, while the general who attacks and fails can at least claim he tried? There is one passage from late November that Stahl highlights, and I keep returning to it. Guderian writes that the losses of vehicles and guns damaged by frost exceed all, and the sentence appears to trail off, or at least Stahl's summary suggests it does. That interruption, the thought left incomplete, is, for me, the most haunting detail in the entire collection. Here is a man who has spent his career as perhaps the foremost theorist and practitioner of armored warfare in the world, a man who literally wrote the book on Panzer operations, and he cannot bring himself to finish a sentence about the losses his tanks are suffering. What was the word he couldn't write? Expectations? Precedent? Endurance? We don't know. The incomplete sentence sits there in the archive, a gap in the text that is somehow more eloquent than any completed thought would have been. The machinery that Guderian had spent his life advocating for, building, and commanding was being destroyed, not by the enemy's guns, but by the cold, by the roads, by the operational tempo he himself had ordered. To complete that sentence would have been to name the full scale of the disaster, and he couldn't do it, not even to his wife. The final letter, dated the 16th of December, is written the day Guderian is effectively relieved, though the formal dismissal comes on the 26th. Stahl describes it as containing a plea for understanding, addressed to Marguerite, but clearly written with an awareness that it might someday be read by others. There is a quality of self-exoneration in it. Guderian is already beginning to construct the narrative that will eventually become Panzer leader, the story of the competent general betrayed by an incompetent supreme command. But the raw emotion is also genuine. A man is losing his command, his professional identity, and his army. The 2nd Panzer Army, which he built and trained and led from the Channel Coast in 1940 to the outskirts of Tula in 1941, is being shattered in the Soviet counteroffensive. The letter is an attempt to make sense of this. It does not succeed because the events themselves resist sense-making. They resisted in 1941, and they resisted in 2026, sitting in a study with Stahl's article open on the desk, trying to understand a man who knew his campaign was failing and pressed forward anyway. I have read Guderian's memoir 3 times over the years. I have now read these letters through Stahel's publication once. They are not the same man, or rather, they are the same man revealing two truths, the private one, in shaky handwriting to his wife, and the public one, typeset and self-serving, for the bookshops of the 1950s. The memoir is Guderian as he wished to be remembered, bold, prescient, victimized by incompetent superiors. The letters are Guderian as he actually was in the moment, increasingly desperate, privately doubting, professionally trapped, and emotionally fraying at the edges. Neither account is entirely false, but the letters are closer to the truth because they were written without an audience in mind, or at least without the audience of history in mind. They are the sound of a man talking to himself, with his wife's name at the top of the page as the nominal recipient. And what he is telling himself, by December, is that it has all gone wrong, and he doesn't know how to stop it, and the machinery he loves is dying in the cold. Stahel's publication of these letters in 2025 represents one of the most significant recent primary source contributions to Eastern Front historiography. This is not an exaggeration. The private correspondence of senior German commanders during Operation Typhoon has been remarkably scarce. Most of what we know about the German generals' states of mind during the Moscow campaign comes from their post-war memoirs, which were written with the benefit of hindsight and the motivation of self-justification, or from official war diaries, which record decisions but not emotions. Guderian's letters fill a gap that historians have been aware of for decades, but unable to address for lack of source material. Popular documentaries on the Battle of Moscow, and there are many, overwhelmingly rely on Guderian's memoir as their primary source for the German Panzer commander's perspective. Almost none, as of this writing, have incorporated the letters. This documentary is, as far as I am aware, among the first audio treatments to use them. This matters not because novelty has value for its own sake, but because the letters fundamentally change our understanding of what Guderian knew when he knew it, and what he chose to do with that knowledge. The gap between private knowledge and public action is the story of this chapter. It is also, in a broader sense, the story of the entire German command in the autumn of 1941. The gap between private communication and public narrative is not, of course, unique to 1941. It is, if anything, the defining tension of public life in the modern age. In 2026, leaked private messages from political and military leaders routinely contradict their public statements. Texts, emails, and encrypted messages that reveal what the official press conference concealed. The technology changes, the human behavior doesn't. Guderian's letters to his wife are the 1941 equivalent of a leaked signal thread, the private channel revealing what the public performance worked so hard to hide. And the lesson they teach is the same lesson that every leaked communication teaches, that the people making decisions in moments of crisis are often far less confident, far less certain, and far more afraid than the official record allows. The question this raises, for historians, for citizens, for anyone who relies on official accounts of consequential events, is how much of what we think we know about the past is the public version rather than the private one. How many other Panzer leaders sit on library shelves, their confident narratives unchallenged, because the letters that contradict them remain unpublished, untranslated, or lost. This chapter contains almost no tonnage figures, no transmission specifications, no railway throughput calculations. That absence is deliberate. After 3 chapters of dense technical data, the listener needs to be reminded that behind every statistic was a human being. In this case, a specific human being named Heinz Guderian, writing letters to a specific human being named Marguerite, in a specific field headquarters that smelled of wood smoke and diesel fuel, and was by December bitterly cold. The numbers are essential, but the numbers by themselves cannot explain why the offensive continued after the numbers said it should stop. For that, you need the letters. You need to hear a man who understood the mathematics of failure trying to explain it to his wife, in handwriting that got shakier as the weeks went on. You need the incomplete sentence. Losses of vehicles and guns damaged by frost exceed all. Hanging in the air, unfinished, because finishing it would have meant admitting something the culture could not permit and the man could not bear. The Battle of Moscow was lost in the railway yards, and the transmission casings and the supply depots, yes, but it was also lost in the space between what men knew privately and what they were willing to say publicly. That space, between the letter and the memoir, between the truth and the narrative, is where the real history lives. Guderian survived the war. He was briefly imprisoned, then released, and lived until 1954. Panzer Leader was published in 1952 and became one of the best-selling military memoirs of the 20th century. It shaped the English-speaking world's understanding of the Eastern Front for decades. The letters to his wife were not known to historians until Stahel's work brought them to scholarly attention. For over 70 years, we had only Guderian's chosen version of events, the version crafted for readers, polished by editors, designed to present a specific man in a specific light. Now we have the other version, the real one, the one with the shaky handwriting and the incomplete sentences, and the slow, private accumulation of despair. And the question I'm left with, sitting in my study with both texts open, is this. If Guderian knew, if he genuinely knew, in his bones and in his letters, that the offensive was failing, who else in the German command knew, and how many of them also said nothing? Chapter 5. The Vyazma Trap. Victory as Poison. The 7th of October, 1941, east of the ancient Russian city of Vyazma, roughly 230 kilometers west of Moscow, the pincers close. The 3rd Panzer Group, advancing from the north, and the 4th Panzer Group, driving from the south, have linked up, and in doing so they have sealed the largest encirclement of the Moscow campaign. Trapped inside are the remnants of the Soviet 19th, 20th, 24th, and 32nd Armies, a force that the German Army communiqué, issued on the 18th of October, will claim totals 663,000 prisoners, along with 1,242 tanks and 5,412 guns. Simultaneously, south of Vyazma, the Bryansk pocket has trapped additional Soviet forces. The twin encirclements represent a catastrophic Soviet defeat, the destruction of an entire echelon of the Moscow defense. The road to the Soviet capital, on paper, is open, and in the headquarters of Army Group Center, the mood, if we can reconstruct it from the war diary's carefully neutral language, is something approaching elation. The Soviets have been broken. Moscow is within reach. The war, surely, is about to end. It didn't end. And the reason it didn't end is embedded in a detail that appears on the same page of the Army Group Center War Diary as the triumphant prisoner count. A handwritten addendum, not in the main text, but in the margins or the supplementary notes, observes that mopping up operations continue and that significant enemy groups have broken through to the east. The typed number and the handwritten caveat coexist on the same document, on the same date, and they tell two entirely different stories. The typed number says, "We have won a great victory." The handwritten note says, "The victory is incomplete, and the enemy we didn't capture is still out there." This is the tension I want to explore in this chapter. The idea that the Vyazma-Bryansk encirclements, far from being the unambiguous triumphs they appear to be in the standard narrative, were something more complicated and more dangerous. They were a victory that consumed the one resource Germany could not replace: time. The mechanics of the encirclement deserve scrutiny, because understanding how it worked explains why it leaked. A successful encirclement requires two things: a mobile force fast enough to close the ring before the enemy escapes, and an infantry force strong enough to seal the ring once it's closed. In October 1941, the Panzer groups provided the first element. They drove the pincers forward at 50 to 80 kilometers per day on good terrain, closing the ring around Vyazma with commendable speed. But the infantry divisions that were supposed to seal the ring and prevent breakouts moved on foot, at roughly 25 to 30 kilometers per day. The gap between the Panzer spearheads and the following infantry created a period, hours in some sectors, days in others, where the encirclement existed on the map but not on the ground. The ring had holes. Soviet commanders, some of them experienced and aggressive, found those holes. Thousands of soldiers, disorganized, many without heavy weapons, some without any weapons at all, filtered through the gaps in the German cordon and moved east. Some were captured in subsequent days, some died in the forests, and some, a number that the German communiqué doesn't and can't quantify, reached Soviet lines east of the encirclement and were absorbed into the formations that were frantically consolidating the next defense line at Mozhaisk. The prisoner count itself is a contested number, and the contestation matters because it affects our understanding of how many Soviet soldiers were actually removed from the fight, versus how many survived to fight again. The German claim of 663,000 prisoners across both pockets has been disputed by Soviet and Russian historiography, which places the Vyazma figure significantly lower. Some estimates cite approximately 452,000 for the Vyazma pocket alone, with additional captures at Bryansk. The discrepancy is not trivial. If the German number is inflated, and there are institutional reasons why it might be, since large prisoner counts validated the offensive and justified its costs, then fewer Soviet soldiers were actually neutralized, and more escaped to form the nucleus of future resistance. The truth probably lies somewhere between the two figures, complicated by the fact that prisoner is itself an imprecise category that could include wounded men who died in captivity within days, civilians swept up in the chaos, and soldiers who surrendered and then escaped. Both the German and the Soviet tallies were shaped by propaganda incentives. The Germans had reason to inflate the number to demonstrate success, and the Soviets had reason to minimize it to reduce the scale of the catastrophe. The historian's task is to navigate between these competing exaggerations, and the honest answer is that we don't know the precise figure, and probably never will. What we do know is what the encirclement cost in time, and this is where the victory as poison thesis becomes concrete. The pincers closed on the 7th of October. The mopping up operations, the reduction of organized resistance inside the pocket, the processing and guarding of prisoners, the consolidation of the cordon, consumed the next 11 days. Through the 18th of October, 11 days. This doesn't sound like much in the abstract, but consider what those 11 days meant in context. The Panzer divisions assigned to seal the encirclement could not simultaneously advance on Moscow. They were tied down on the perimeter of the pocket, facing inward, dealing with breakout attempts and disarming captured formations. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking. The Rasputitsa, the autumn mud season, was arriving. The weather window for continued offensive operations was closing. Every day spent reducing the Vyazma pocket was a day not spent covering the remaining 230 kilometers to Moscow. And the Soviets, east of the pocket, were using every one of those 11 days to do exactly what the Germans could not afford to let them do. Dig in, bring up reserves, and consolidate the Mozhaisk defense line. There is something I find almost unbearable about the human dimension of the prisoner count, a dimension that moves beyond strategy and into the moral catastrophe that accompanied German operations in the Soviet Union. 663,000 prisoners, if we accept the German figure, required feeding. At even the most minimal rations, an enormous logistical burden for an army that was, as we've established, already incapable of adequately supplying its own troops. In practice, the Wehrmacht did not feed most of them. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war on the Eastern Front constitutes one of the largest mass atrocities of the Second World War. Between October 1941 and January 1942, across all German-held territories, between 300,000 and 500,000 Soviet prisoners died each month, from starvation, exposure, disease, and deliberate killing. The Vyazma prisoners were not an exception. They were marched westward in columns, without food, without shelter, through the same Rasputitsa mud that was halting the German advance. Those who fell were left where they dropped. This is not a logistics footnote. It is the moral underside of every encirclement statistic, and it must be stated plainly. The German victory at Vyazma was achieved at, and accompanied by, a scale of human suffering that defies the capacity of numbers to convey. When I was reviewing the Soviet after-action reports for the Western Front Reformation in late October 1941, I found it striking how quickly the men who escaped the Vyazma pocket were reintegrated into the Soviet force structure. The process was not gentle. NKVD screening, interrogation about why they had retreated rather than fighting to the death, reassignment to whatever formation needed bodies. But it was efficient. Soldiers who had walked out of the encirclement, some of them having marched for days through German-held territory, evading patrols, foraging for food, appeared in the strength returns of newly forming Soviet armies within weeks. These men were not in good condition. Many were traumatized, malnourished, and had lost their personal weapons. But they were alive, they had combat experience, and they knew what the German army looked like at close range. Some of them would be standing in the Moscow defense lines in November. Some of them would be advancing westward in the counteroffensive of December. The men the Germans didn't capture at Vyazma are, in a sense, the hidden protagonists of the next 3 months of the war. the survivors who carried the experience of catastrophic defeat forward and converted it, improbably, into the raw material of eventual resistance. There is a specific irony buried in the Vyazma story that connects it to the myth we'll examine later, in Chapter 10, about the so-called Siberian divisions. Several of the Soviet divisions destroyed in the Vyazma pocket, including the 91st and 166th Rifle Divisions, had been among the divisions transferred west from the Siberian Military District in June and July of 1941 as part of the 24th Army. These were, in the technical sense, Siberian divisions, formed in Siberia, manned partly by Siberian personnel. They didn't save Moscow. They were annihilated at Vyazma in October, weeks before the battle for Moscow reached its crisis. The popular narrative of Siberian divisions saving Moscow requires these divisions to arrive at the last moment, fresh and fierce, and turn the tide. The archival record shows that the original Siberian transfers had already been committed, fought, and in some cases completely destroyed before the decisive phase of the battle even began. The myth and the reality exist in different timelines, and the Vyazma pocket is where they diverge. The strategic aftermath of Vyazma is a study in asymmetric consequences, a victory that hurt the victor more than it helped. Germany gained 663,000 prisoners, over 1,000 tanks, and 5,000 guns. These are enormous numbers. They look magnificent in a communiqué. But what did they buy? Not Moscow, not the collapse of Soviet resistance, not the end of the war. They bought 11 days of delay, the consumption of fuel and ammunition that was already scarce, the tying down of mobile forces that should have been racing east, and the administrative burden of processing a prisoner population larger than most German cities. Meanwhile, the Soviets, who had suffered a catastrophe by any measure, used those 11 days to do something the German command apparently didn't anticipate. They rebuilt their defensive line. The Mozhaysk line, anchored on the 4 gateway approaches to Moscow, Volokolamsk, Mozhaysk, Maloyaroslavets, and Kaluga, was reinforced with newly mobilized divisions, militia formations, and the survivors of the encirclement. The line was thin, under-equipped, and manned by men who were, in many cases, barely trained, but it existed. And its existence meant that the German advance, when it resumed after the pocket was reduced, would face organized resistance rather than open road. Vyazma didn't open the road to Moscow. It closed a window. The concept of a tactical victory that accelerates strategic defeat is not unique to Vyazma, but Vyazma is one of history's clearest examples. The German army won the battle. It destroyed multiple Soviet armies. It captured more prisoners in a single operation than most nations have soldiers in their entire military. And it was worse off after the victory than before it, further behind schedule, shorter on fuel, with its mobile forces exhausted, and its infantry scattered across a vast perimeter of prisoners and bypassed enemy groups. The men who planned Typhoon had assumed that the encirclement would end Soviet resistance west of Moscow. Instead, it merely disorganized it, temporarily, partially, and at enormous cost in the one currency Germany could least afford to spend: time. The typed communiqué of the 18th of October celebrated the triumph. The handwritten marginalia worried about the breakouts. Both were right, but only the handwritten note understood what the triumph was actually costing. The pocket was sealed. The war went on. And the 11 days that Germany spent counting prisoners were the 11 days that the Soviet Union spent preparing the defense that would stop the German advance for good. Chapter 6. The Rasputitsa, When the Earth Fights Back. The 14th of October, 1941. The headquarters of the German Fourth Army transmits a situation report to Army Group Center. The language is the standard bureaucratic German of military communications, precise, unemotional, stripped of adjectives. But the content is extraordinary. Movement by motorized vehicles off the roads is impossible. Not difficult, not inadvisable, impossible. The report continues, noting that the Army's tracked vehicles, the tanks, the half-tracks, the self-propelled guns, are consuming fuel at 3 to 4 times their normal rate, because the mud is forcing continuous high RPM, low-gear operation just to maintain forward motion. The document was typed on standard field report paper. I've seen a copy, or rather, a reproduction in a secondary source, and there's a detail about it that I find oddly human. The lower right corner of the page has what appears to be a coffee stain. Someone read this report, this document describing the operational paralysis of an entire army, over breakfast. They presumably continued eating. The coffee stain is not, of course, historically significant, but it suggests something about the normalization of crisis, the way catastrophe, when it arrives gradually enough, becomes just another item on the morning briefing schedule. The Rasputitsa. The word is Russian, and its literal translation, the time without roads, is more accurate than any military euphemism could be. It refers to the period, occurring in both autumn and spring, when rainfall and snowmelt transform the unpaved road network of central Russia into a substance that is neither liquid nor solid, but something in between, a heavy, clinging, bottomless mire that swallows vehicles to their axles and horses to their bellies. In the Moscow region, the autumn Rasputitsa typically begins in early to mid-October and lasts until the ground freezes hard in November. It happens every year. It is as predictable as the sunrise. It is not a weather event in the sense that a blizzard or a hurricane is a weather event. It is a seasonal condition, embedded in the geology and hydrology of the region, and anyone with access to a basic meteorological reference for central Russia could have predicted it to within a week or two of accuracy. The German intelligence files from before Barbarossa, now accessible in the Bundesarchiv, contain meteorological assessments that did, in fact, note the existence of the Rasputitsa. The German command knew it was coming. The question, and it is a question that has never been satisfactorily answered, is why this knowledge did not alter operational planning in any meaningful way. The physics of the Rasputitsa deserve a moment of attention, because without understanding what the mud actually was, it's easy to dismiss it as a minor inconvenience rather than a campaign-ending phenomenon. Russian soil in the Moscow region is predominantly heavy clay overlying a shallow water table. When autumn rains begin, and they begin gradually, a few millimeters per day at first, then building, the upper layer of soil becomes saturated. Because the clay substrate is nearly impermeable, the water doesn't drain downward. It sits in the topsoil, creating a colloidal suspension, a semi-liquid mass with the consistency of wet concrete and the adhesive properties of industrial glue. An unpaved road, which is to say more than 95% of the road network in the Army Group Center sector, does not become muddy in the conventional sense. It ceases to be a road entirely. The surface layer, churned by the first vehicles to pass over it, transforms into a trench of brown-gray slurry that deepens with every subsequent passage. A standard Wehrmacht 3-ton Opel Blitz truck, a rear-wheel drive vehicle designed for paved European highways, sank to its axles within meters of leaving the pavement. Even tracked vehicles lost effective mobility as mud packed into their running gear, clogging the teeth of the drive sprockets, building up between the track links, and adding hundreds of kilograms of dead weight to a suspension system designed for firm ground. The single exception to the road catastrophe was the Minsk-Moscow highway, the one paved road running east-west through Army Group Center's sector. This highway, a 2-lane asphalt road by modern standards, became the sole viable supply artery for an army group of nearly 2 million men. Everything that could move moved on this road. Everything that couldn't move sat in the mud beside it and waited. The highway became a bottleneck of extraordinary density. Supply trucks, ammunition carriers, ambulances, staff cars, horse-drawn wagons, and the occasional Panzer all competing for space on a single strip of pavement that was itself degrading under the traffic load. When a vehicle broke down on the highway, and they broke down constantly, it created a blockage that could halt traffic for hours in both directions. The war diary entries from mid-October read like traffic reports from a commuter's nightmare, if the commuter were carrying 75mm ammunition and the traffic jam extended for 20 kilometers. I want to resist the temptation to describe the Rasputitsa purely in mechanical terms, because it was also experienced by hundreds of thousands of men and hundreds of thousands of horses, and their experience of it was fundamentally physical, exhausting, demoralizing, and in many cases lethal. German infantry soldiers, who carried their own equipment and marched on foot, found themselves wading through mud that reached their knees, and sometimes their waists. Each step required the extraction of a boot from suction that could literally pull the footwear off a man's foot. Pace slowed from the standard 25 to 30 kilometers per day to, in some sectors, less than 5. Horses, which still constituted the primary motive power for German infantry division supply trains, suffered catastrophically. They couldn't get footing. They strained against loads that the mud made immovable. Some drowned, simply sank into the mire, and couldn't be extracted before they suffocated. Others died of exhaustion, their hearts giving out under the effort of pulling wagons through conditions that no animal could sustain. The veterinary reports from Army Group Center in October 1941 record horse losses in terms that suggest not a transportation problem, but an ecological disaster. The German army, at this stage of the war, was still fundamentally a horse-drawn force. The infantry divisions moved their heavy equipment, their artillery, their rations, and their wounded on horse-drawn wagons. When the horses died, the supply system died with them. When I was reviewing the Quartermaster General's vehicle status reports for October 1941, I found it striking, and more than a little infuriating, how consistently the German general's post-war memoirs frame the Rasputitsa as an unforeseeable natural disaster, as if the autumn mud season in central Russia were a freak event rather than an annual occurrence. Guderian, in Panzer Leader, treats the mud as though it arrived without warning, a malicious act of Russian nature designed specifically to thwart the Wehrmacht. Bach's diary is more honest. He records the mud's arrival with grim resignation rather than surprise. But even Bach doesn't confront the obvious question. If you knew the mud was coming in October, why did you launch your decisive offensive on the 2nd of October? The German meteorological intelligence files contain the answer to whether they knew. And the answer is yes, they knew. Soviet sources, unsurprisingly, point this out with some asperity. The Rasputitsa isn't a secret. It's not a classified military capability. It's weather. It happens every year. Farmers know about it. German intelligence files knew about it. And yet the operational planning for Typhoon treated it as though it either wouldn't happen or wouldn't matter. This is not the mud's fault. This is a planning failure. A failure to incorporate known environmental conditions into operational timelines. And it cost Germany approximately 3 weeks of offensive capability at the most critical moment of the campaign. The 3 weeks matter because they were 3 weeks during which the Soviet command was not idle. The mud hurt both sides. Soviet formations were also immobilized, their vehicles also bogged, their roads also impassable. But the asymmetry of the situation made the mud's effects profoundly unequal in strategic terms. Germany needed to advance. The Soviet Union needed time. The mud gave the Soviets exactly what they needed, and denied the Germans exactly what they needed. And it did so with the impersonal equity of geology. During the Rasputitsa pause, Zhukov, who had taken command of the Western Front on the 10th of October, used every available hour to consolidate the Mozhaisk defense line, to bring up newly mobilized divisions, to integrate the survivors of the Vyazma Encirclement into the defensive structure, and to begin preparing the reserve armies that would eventually deliver the December counteroffensive. The mud that was destroying German trucks was buying Soviet time. And time, for a nation that had just lost 600,000 men in a single encirclement, but could mobilize 600,000 more, was the most valuable commodity in the war. The halt came officially on the 31st of October, when OKH ordered a cessation of all offensive operations until the supply situation improved and the ground either dried or froze hard enough to support vehicle traffic. The order was, in a sense, merely an acknowledgement of reality. The offensive had already halted in practice, because the trucks that carried the fuel that powered the tanks had run out of fuel themselves, and the tanks that were supposed to advance couldn't move without fuel, and the roads that were supposed to carry the fuel trucks had ceased to exist. The circular logic of logistical collapse, you can't advance because you can't supply, and you can't supply because you can't advance, had reached its terminal stage. Army Group Center sat in the mud, waiting. Its vehicle fleet, which had entered Russia with roughly 14,000 trucks, had seen operational rates fall below 40%. Over 200,000 vehicles had been lost across the entire Eastern Front since June. Replacement vehicles were arriving, but they were largely two-wheel drive models, essentially useless in conditions where even tracked vehicles couldn't move off-road. The Wehrmacht was not being resupplied. It was being sent vehicles that could not function in the environment where they were needed. The Rasputitsa ended, as it always does, when the temperature dropped below freezing and the mud solidified into iron-hard ruts. This happened gradually, through the first 2 weeks of November, and when it was complete, the German command faced a new set of conditions. The ground was passable again, but the cold was arriving, and the army had no winter clothing, no cold-weather lubricants, and no reserves. The question, which we'll address in a later chapter, was whether the brief window of frozen, passable ground between mid-November and the deep cold of December was enough to resume the offensive and reach Moscow. The answer, as we know, was no. But the Rasputitsa had already done its decisive work before the freeze arrived. It had consumed 3 weeks. It had degraded the vehicle fleet beyond recovery. It had given the Soviets the time to build a defense line and begin mobilizing the forces for a counteroffensive. The mud didn't stop the Germans at Moscow. The mud stopped the Germans from reaching Moscow in time to fight the battle on terms that might have favored them. By the time the ground froze and movement was again possible, the opportunity, if it had ever existed at all, was gone. A seasonal phenomenon that arrives every year, in the same month, for the same duration, had wrecked the timeline of the most important German offensive of 1941. The Earth itself had fought back, and the Earth, unlike the Soviet armies, could not be encircled, outflanked, or forced to surrender. Next 6 chapters, approximately 2,000 to 2,500 words per chapter, 10 paragraphs, each paragraph around 4 to 6 sentences. Chapter 7, The City That Almost Died, October 16, 1941. The 15th of October, 1941, in Moscow, the State Defense Committee, the GKO, the supreme wartime authority of the Soviet Union, issues an order that will trigger the most dangerous 72 hours in the city's modern history. The order instructs the diplomatic corps and key government ministries to evacuate to Kuibyshev, a city on the Volga roughly 850 kilometers to the southeast. The order is classified. It is not announced to the public. But within hours, the fact of the evacuation leaks, through factory managers loading trucks, through ministry officials burning documents in courtyard barrels, through the simple observation that government cars are heading east, loaded with crates and luggage, and the officials who ride in them are not coming back. By the morning of the 16th of October, the population of Moscow understands, through the instantaneous communication network of rumor, that their government may be abandoning them. What happens next is an event that Soviet historiography spent 50 years trying to erase from the record, and that only the post-Soviet archival releases of the 1990s have allowed us to reconstruct in any detail. Declassified, NKVD situation reports, the Internal Security Police's own daily assessments, describe a city in the grip of spontaneous breakdown. Workers at several Moscow factories arrived on the morning of the 16th to discover that their directors had fled during the night, taking factory vehicles loaded with personal belongings. In one documented instance, workers found the factory safe, open, and empty. The director had taken the cash reserves and vanished. The NKVD reports describe this in the bloodless bureaucratic language of Soviet officialdom, unauthorized departure of responsible personnel. But the reality behind the euphemism was raw and visceral. The people in charge had run. The workers who were left behind understood exactly what that meant. The panic spread with the logic of a contagion. Looting broke out in some districts. Party officials' cars were stopped and attacked by crowds. Spontaneous work stoppages shut down factories across the city. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of citizens attempted to flee eastward, jamming the roads leading out of the capital, carrying whatever they could pack. Rumors multiplied. Stalin had fled. The Germans would arrive by nightfall. The city was being abandoned to its fate. The NKVD reports, written in real time by agents positioned throughout the city, record these events with the clinical detachment of men trained to observe disorder rather than feel it. The CIA's declassified analysis, Lubyanka in the days of the battle for Moscow, corroborates the severity from a Western intelligence perspective. This was not a minor disturbance. This was a major city of 4 million people experiencing something very close to social collapse. The historiographical debate around October 16th centers on a question of degree. Soviet-era histories, when they mention the day at all, reduce it to a brief and quickly contained disturbance, a momentary lapse that was swiftly corrected by the party's steady hand. Post-Soviet archival evidence suggests something far more serious, a genuine breakdown of civic order that lasted approximately 3 days and was only ended by a combination of reassurance and terror. The two interpretations are not easily reconciled. The NKVD reports describe both the panic and the measures taken to suppress it: mass arrests, summary authority granted to security patrols, the public execution of looters. The Soviet system stabilized Moscow, not by calming its citizens, but by making disobedience more frightening than the approaching Germans. The question of whether October 16th was a near collapse or a controlled scare depends ultimately on which NKVD file you read, and how much weight you give to reports written by an organization whose institutional purpose was to minimize the appearance of regime vulnerability. Stalin stayed. This is the single most consequential fact of the crisis, and it is worth stating without embellishment. He reportedly deliberated on whether to leave. There are multiple second-hand accounts suggesting a train was prepared for his departure, but ultimately he remained in Moscow. His decision to stay was communicated to the city, and its effect was immediate, though not instantaneous. The knowledge that Stalin was still in the Kremlin did not end the panic on its own. What ended the panic was the decree of the 19th of October, which imposed martial law on Moscow, a state of siege that authorized NKVD patrols to use lethal force against violators of public order. Between Stalin's presence and the NKVD's authority, the city was brought to heel. But brought to heel is not the same as rallied. The population of Moscow complied with the restoration of order. Whether they believed in it is another question entirely. I struggle with this chapter, and I want to be honest about why. It would be easy and narratively satisfying to frame October 16th as a heroic story of a city that faced its darkest hour and rallied to the defense of the motherland. Heroic stories are comforting. They confirm our preference for resilience narratives, and October 16th does contain genuine elements of resilience. The hundreds of thousands of civilians, mostly women, who dug anti-tank ditches in freezing rain, the factory workers who continued production under bombardment, the militias that formed voluntarily to defend their districts. These things are real, and they matter. But they exist alongside the looting, the panic, the fleeing officials, and the summary executions. The city rallied, but first it broke, and the breaking is the part of the story that has been systematically suppressed, first by Soviet censorship, and then by the gravitational pull of heroic national mythology. Telling both parts, the breaking and the rallying, is, I believe, the only honest way to tell it. The German command, as far as the archival record shows, never learned in real time how close Moscow came to internal disintegration on October 16th. German intelligence assessments from mid-October focus on the military situation, troop dispositions, defense line locations, Soviet force strengths, not on the political stability of the Soviet capital. This is a significant intelligence failure, though one might argue it wouldn't have mattered operationally. The Panzer spearheads were bogged in the Rasputitsa and couldn't have exploited the panic even if they'd known about it. But the counterfactual lingers. If the German advance had been 48 hours closer, if the Rasputitsa had arrived 2 days later, or the offensive had launched 2 days earlier, the psychological shock of German forces visibly approaching the city might have intersected with the October 16th panic to produce something irreversible. Germany lost the Battle of Moscow in part because it didn't know it was winning a different kind of battle, the battle for Soviet civilian morale. The men and women who lived through October 16th carried that experience with them into November and December. This is speculative. I can't prove it with a document, but I believe the terror of those 3 days hardened something in the city's population. The people who stayed, who didn't flee, who stood in line for bread rations while NKVD patrols enforced order at gunpoint. These people had already faced the worst thing that could happen short of the Germans actually arriving. They had seen their government waver, their factory directors run, their neighbors loot, and they had survived it. The December counteroffensive would be fought by Soviet soldiers, not Moscow civilians. But the defense lines those soldiers held were dug by Moscow civilians, and the factories that supplied them were staffed by Moscow civilians. And the railway network that moved reserves into position was operated by Moscow civilians. The people who endured October 16th were the infrastructure of the city's defense. Their willingness to continue functioning, motivated by patriotism or by fear, or by the simple absence of any alternative, was as essential as any tank brigade. The modern resonance of October 16th is difficult to ignore. Urban resilience under military threat is now a formal discipline of study, driven in significant part by the experience of Ukrainian cities since 2022. Kiev, in February of that year, faced a moment of potential panic, strikingly similar to Moscow's. Russian armored columns approaching from the north, rumors of imminent assault, the question of whether the government would stay or flee. President Zelensky's decision to remain in Kiev performed the same function as Stalin's decision to remain in Moscow. It communicated to the population and to the world that the capital would stand. The comparison is imperfect. The political systems, the scale of the threat, and the international context are all different. But the underlying dynamics are the same: rumor, evacuation confusion, the fragility of civic order under existential threat, and the outsized significance of a single leader's physical presence. The coffee stain on the Fourth Army's Rasputitsa report from the previous chapter suggested the normalization of military crisis. October 16th suggests something different: the sudden denormalization of civilian life, the moment when the infrastructure of daily existence, factories opening, trams running, shops stocking bread, simply ceases, and 4 million people are left to calculate their chances alone. That calculation, made independently by millions of individuals over the course of 72 hours, produced a range of responses: flight, looting, volunteering, paralysis, defiance, collaboration. The NKVD reports document all of them. The Soviet heroic narrative selects only the last two. The honest narrative includes them all. Moscow didn't fall on October 16, 1941. But for 3 days, falling was a plausible outcome. Not because the Germans were at the gates, but because the city's own social fabric, stretched beyond endurance by 3 months of catastrophic news from the front, momentarily tore. It was repaired, with courage, with force, and with the cold authority of a state that would not permit its citizens the luxury of despair. Chapter 8. The Man on Platform 1. Zhukov takes command. The 10th of October, 1941. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov arrives at the headquarters of the Soviet Western Front. He has been summoned from Leningrad, where he spent the previous week stabilizing the defense of that besieged city, and his new assignment is both simple to describe and nearly impossible to execute: stop the German advance on Moscow. The forces available to him for this task are, by any rational assessment, inadequate. The Western Front's total tank strength is approximately 90 operational vehicles. 90 tanks to defend the approaches to a city of 4 million people, fewer tanks than a single full-strength German Panzer division would field. The infantry divisions manning the Mozhaisk defense line are a mixture of newly mobilized formations with minimal training, battered remnants of the Vyazma Encirclement, and militia units whose enthusiasm exceeds their combat capability. The situation, when Zhukov takes stock of it, is not desperate in the dramatic sense. It is desperate in the administrative sense. There is simply not enough of anything. Zhukov's first action upon arriving at headquarters, according to his memoirs, was to demand a complete situational update. The staff officers could not provide one. Communications with several surrounded Soviet armies had been lost. The Vyazma pocket had severed the front's organizational coherence, and no one at headquarters had a reliable picture of which units still existed, where they were, or what condition they were in. Zhukov's response, as recorded in a subordinate's memoir, was silence, followed by a methodical series of telephone calls, in which he personally contacted every surviving formation commander on the front and demanded their precise coordinates and combat strength. He did this with a map and a field telephone, over approximately 6 hours. There was nothing elegant about it, no stroke of strategic genius, just a man with a phone, calling unit after unit, writing numbers on a map, building a picture of his front from the bottom up, because the top-down picture had ceased to exist. The Mozhaisk defense line, the position on which Zhukov chose to make his stand, was a series of fortified zones at roughly 100 to 125 kilometers west of Moscow, anchored on the 4 main approach routes to the capital: the Volokolamsk Highway in the north, the Mozhaisk Highway in the center, and the roads through Maloyaroslavets and Kaluga in the south. The line exploited natural obstacles, rivers, forests, elevation changes, supplemented by hastily constructed field fortifications. The most significant of these fortifications were anti-tank ditches, dug by Moscow's civilian population, hundreds of thousands of people, predominantly women, working in autumn rain and then freezing temperatures. The ditches were 3 to 4 meters deep and 4 to 5 meters wide, with a sloped forward face designed to prevent tanks from driving through them. The construction of these ditches, measured in aggregate, represents one of the largest civilian labor mobilizations in military history. It is also one of the least commemorated. The women who dug them do not appear in most popular accounts of the battle, which prefer to focus on generals and tank commanders. Zhukov's defensive method was not subtle. He concentrated his meager reserves at the 4 gateway approaches and accepted that the spaces between them would be thinly held or not held at all. Units that could not be supported were, in effect, written off, assigned missions that amounted to delaying the enemy at the cost of their own destruction. Zhukov's willingness to make these calculations, to decide which units would be sacrificed and which would be reinforced, is the quality that distinguishes him from a merely competent commander. It is also the quality that makes him morally uncomfortable to admire. He authorized the deployment of NKVD blocking detachments behind retreating Soviet units, armed security troops with orders to prevent unauthorized withdrawal, by force if necessary. Stavka Directive No. 270, issued in August 1941, provided the legal authority for this measure. Its practical application meant that Soviet soldiers who retreated without orders could be, and were, shot by their own side. The defense of Moscow was conducted under conditions of coercion that extended from the civilian population digging ditches to the soldiers manning them. The fighting at Volokholamsk, on the northern approach to Moscow, produced the most famous legend of the Moscow defense, and also one of its most thoroughly documented fabrications. The 316th Rifle Division, commanded by General Ivan Panfilov, held the Volokholamsk highway against repeated German attacks through late October and November. The division's defense was genuinely tenacious. Panfilov's men held their positions against armored assaults with limited anti-tank capability and suffered severe casualties. Panfilov himself was killed on the 18th of November. The division's performance was real, and it was subsequently recognized with the Guards designation, becoming the 8th Guards Rifle Division. But the specific story that emerged from this defense, the legend of the 28 Panfilov Guardsmen, 28 soldiers who supposedly destroyed 18 German tanks and died to the last man defending a position on the highway, was fabricated. It was a creation of the military newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda, and it was investigated by Soviet military prosecutors in 1948, who concluded that the journalist who wrote the original account had invented the specific details. Several of the men listed as killed turned out to be alive. One had been captured and had collaborated with the German occupiers. The investigation was suppressed for decades. This matters, and I want to explain why it matters to me as a historian, beyond the obvious importance of factual accuracy. The Panfilov legend is an example of how wartime myth-making and genuine sacrifice coexist in the same event, occupying the same physical space and the same historical moment, but serving different purposes. The 316th Rifle Division fought with extraordinary determination at Volokholamsk. That is true. Individual soldiers performed acts of courage that, in a just world, would be their own sufficient memorial. That is also true. But the specific narrative constructed around them, 28 men, 18 tanks, a last stand to the death, was propaganda. It was useful propaganda, and it inspired real courage in real soldiers who heard the story and drew strength from it. But it was not what happened. The distinction between the division fought heroically and these specific 28 men did this specific thing is the distinction between history and myth, and the fact that both can be true simultaneously, the heroism real, the details false, is one of the most uncomfortable features of wartime history. To me, the most telling aspect of Zhukov's command at Moscow is not any single decision, but the aggregate pattern, the relentless, almost mechanical process of triage that characterized his first weeks on the front. He did not devise a brilliant stratagem. He did not discover a hidden weakness in the German position. He did what was available to him. He identified the sectors that mattered most, concentrated his scarce resources there, accepted catastrophic losses in the sectors he couldn't reinforce, and maintained an iron discipline that made retreat without authorization more dangerous for Soviet soldiers than advancing into German fire. This is not the kind of generalship that inspires admiration in the conventional sense. It is generalship by subtraction, removing every option except fighting, and then fighting with whatever is left. Zhukov's defenders argue that the situation permitted nothing else. His critics argue that the human cost of his methods was unconscionable even by the standards of the Eastern Front. Both positions have merit. Both are uncomfortable. The broader question of Zhukov's command raises issues that extend well beyond 1941 and into contemporary military ethics. The question of what a commander is morally permitted to order subordinates to endure, how much suffering, how much risk, how much near certain death, has no cleaner answer in 2026 than it did in the autumn of 1941. Modern military doctrine emphasizes mission command and the obligation to preserve forces for future operations. Zhukov's approach at Moscow was the opposite, the expenditure of forces in the present to buy survival for the future. Both approaches have their logic. Neither has a monopoly on moral clarity. The defense of Moscow was not won by a genius. It was won by a man willing to spend lives at a rate that his enemy could not match, in a cause that the men being spent had little choice but to serve. Histories of Moscow 1941 tend to frame Zhukov as either a savior or a butcher. I suspect he was both, simultaneously, and that the impossibility of reconciling those two roles is exactly why the Battle of Moscow remains morally difficult to narrate. The 90 tanks he commanded at the start of his tenure would grow over the following weeks as new formations arrived and Lend-Lease deliveries reached the front. But in mid-October, with 90 tanks and a front that existed more on paper than on the ground, Zhukov's primary weapon was not armor or artillery. It was the willingness of the Soviet state and of the man who commanded its armies to accept losses that would have been politically and morally unthinkable for any Western democracy. This willingness was not courage in any simple sense. It was a product of a political system that valued state survival above individual life, commanded by a man whose personal temperament aligned with that valuation. Moscow was saved. The cost of saving it is a question that the archives record but cannot answer. The Mozhaisk line held, not everywhere and not without cracks, but enough. By late October, the combination of Soviet defensive resistance and the onset of the Rasputitsa had ground the German advance to a near halt. Zhukov had bought time. He had bought it with anti-tank ditches dug by women, with blocking detachments behind his own lines, with divisions thrown into positions they couldn't hold long enough to slow the enemy by hours or days, and with the quiet administrative work of a man on a telephone, calling unit after unit, building a picture of a front that was broken, and then, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, reassembling it. The question now was whether the time he had bought would be enough. Enough for the reserves to arrive, enough for the factories to resume production, enough for the counteroffensive that was being planned in the back rooms of the Stavka. That question would not be answered until December. But by late October, for the first time since the 2nd of October, the German advance had something in front of it besides open road. It had Zhukov's line. And behind that line, invisible to German intelligence, the machinery of a counteroffensive was beginning to turn. Chapter 9. The Forge East of the Urals. There is a shipping manifest. I haven't held the original, but I've seen it referenced in multiple secondary sources on Soviet industrial evacuation. From Kharkov Locomotive Factory number 183, dated sometime in October 1941. This was the factory that produced the T-34, the tank that had shocked Guderian's forces at Mitsensk. The manifest lists, item by item, the crating and loading sequence for the plant's machine tools, the lathes, the boring mills, the hydraulic presses, the overhead cranes, the thousands of components that constituted a functioning tank factory. One item stands out, a horizontal boring mill, manufactured by Schiess de Vries, weighing 18.7 tons. This single machine tool required its own freight car. The entire factory relocation consumed approximately 1,500 freight cars. One factory, 1,500 freight cars. And factory number 183 was one of 1,523 industrial enterprises evacuated eastward between July and November of 1941. The scale of what the Soviet Union accomplished in those 4 months defies easy narration. The GKO, the State Defense Committee, established a council for evacuation in July, and what followed was the largest forced industrial migration in human history. Roughly 1,523 factories, along with an estimated 10 million workers and their families, were loaded onto trains and shipped east, beyond the Volga, beyond the Urals, to cities like Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Magnitogorsk, and Nizhny Tagil. The aggregate statistics are staggering. Approximately 1.5 million freight car loads of industrial equipment, representing, at a rough average of 20 tons per car, some 30 million tons of machinery. The number is so large that it ceases to function as a meaningful figure. It becomes an abstraction, which is why I keep returning to the boring mill. Item 347, 18.7 tons. Because if I can make you understand one machine on one freight car, you might begin to comprehend the 1,522 factories behind it. The conventional narrative presents this evacuation as a triumph of Soviet planning, a masterpiece of socialist industrial organization, executed under impossible conditions. Post-Soviet memoirs from factory workers and managers tell a considerably messier story. Equipment arrived at destination sites without documentation, crates unmarked, machines unidentifiable without their manuals. Workers arrived without housing. In Nizhny Tagil, the receiving site for factory number 183, families slept in tents and dugouts through the early winter while the factory was being reassembled. Production lines were set up in snowfields under open sky, roofless, with workers operating lathes in temperatures well below freezing. Quality control suffered. Tanks assembled by teenagers replacing drafted machinists had higher defect rates than peacetime production. The evacuation was both an extraordinary achievement and a disorganized nightmare, and the honest telling requires holding both of these truths simultaneously, rather than selecting the one that serves a preferred narrative. The technical challenge of reassembling a tank factory is worth pausing on, because it illuminates why the gap in Soviet production during the evacuation period was so critical for the Battle of Moscow. Producing a T-34 required over 3,000 distinct manufacturing operations, from casting the hull, a process demanding a furnace capable of holding more than 30 tons of molten steel, to boring the gun barrel to precision tolerances measured in hundredths of a millimeter. Each operation required specific machines, specific power supplies, specific water cooling systems, and specific raw material inputs. Moving the machines was not sufficient. You had to recreate the entire infrastructure, the electrical grid capable of powering heavy industry, the water supply, the overhead cranes, the rail sidings for receiving raw materials and shipping finished products. Nizhny Tagil, when the first trainloads of equipment arrived from Kharkov, had none of this at the scale required. It had to be built from scratch, in winter, by a workforce that was simultaneously assembling the factory and living in conditions of extreme privation. Production of the T-34 at Nizhny Tagil resumed in late December 1941 or early January 1942. The exact date varies by source. Initial output was a trickle, perhaps 20 to 25 tanks in the first month, compared to the hundreds per month that the Kharkov plant had been producing before the evacuation. This timeline is critically important for understanding the Battle of Moscow, because it means that during the most intense phase of the fighting, November and December 1941, Soviet tank production was at its absolute nadir. The factories had been packed up, shipped east, and were being reassembled. They were not yet producing. The T-34s that fought at Moscow in November and December were drawn from pre-evacuation stocks, from repair depots, and from the output of other, smaller factories that had not been relocated. This is the gap that Lend-Lease equipment, the British Matildas and Valentines we'll discuss in the next chapter, was filling. Without the evacuated factories, the Soviets couldn't produce enough tanks domestically. Without Lend-Lease, they couldn't supplement the deficit from abroad. Both were needed. Neither alone was sufficient. It fascinates me how the Soviet industrial evacuation gets treated in different historical traditions. In Russian historiography, it remains a point of enormous national pride, proof of the Soviet system's capacity for mobilization under existential threat. In Western historiography, it tends to be mentioned in passing, a paragraph or two in a chapter about the Eastern Front, before the narrative returns to battles and generals. Neither treatment is adequate. The evacuation was not merely a logistical footnote to the military campaign. It was, in a very concrete sense, the act that ensured the Soviet Union could fight a long war. Without the relocated factories, the Red Army's equipment losses in 1941, thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of guns, millions of rifles, would have been irreplaceable. The Soviet Union would have been fighting with a shrinking arsenal against an enemy that, while also suffering attrition, could at least draw on the industrial capacity of occupied Europe. The evacuation didn't win the Battle of Moscow directly, but it guaranteed that even if Moscow had fallen, the Soviet Union would still have had the industrial base to continue the war. This changes the strategic calculus of the entire conflict. There is a detail about the evacuation that I think of as the quiet revelation of this chapter, and it concerns pre-war planning. The conventional telling of the evacuation presents it as a desperate improvisation, a panicked response to the German invasion. But the archival record suggests something more calculated. In the late 1930s, Soviet industrial planners had already begun constructing what might be called shadow factories in the Urals and Western Siberia, duplicate industrial facilities, or at least the foundations for them, positioned beyond the range of any Western invader. These weren't fully operational plants. They were prepared sites, with basic infrastructure, designated as receiving locations for evacuated equipment. The evacuation of 1941 was not pure improvisation. It was the partial execution of a contingency that the Soviet government had been grimly preparing for years. Stalin's regime expected a war with a Western power. It planned for the possibility of losing its Western industrial heartland. The plan was imperfect, the execution was chaotic, and the human cost was immense. But the plan existed, and its existence is what made the difference between a catastrophic but recoverable loss and a terminal one. The workers who reassembled those factories and then operated them through the winter of 1941 and 42 are among the least commemorated participants in the war. They were predominantly women, teenagers, and men too old or physically unfit for military service. They worked 12 to 16-hour shifts in unheated buildings. They lived in barracks, dormitories, and shelters that were often little more than holes dug into the frozen ground. Their diet was inadequate. Their clothing was insufficient for the Ural winter. Many of them sickened and died, not from enemy action, but from exhaustion, cold, and malnutrition. They do not appear in the battle histories. They were not decorated or promoted. They produced the tanks, the shells, the guns, and the aircraft that the Red Army used to fight the war, and their contribution was, in the most literal possible sense, foundational to the Soviet victory. Without them, there would have been nothing to fight with. The concept of supply chain resilience, the idea that a nation's industrial base must be geographically distributed and capable of surviving the loss of any single region, is now a dominant theme in 2026 economic and security policy. The COVID-era disruptions to global manufacturing, the ongoing tension over semiconductor fabrication capacity, concentrated in Taiwan, and the broader reshoring movement in Western economies all reflect the same underlying anxiety that drove Soviet industrial planners in the 1930s. What happens if your primary production centers are suddenly inaccessible? The question is asked of TSMC's fabrication plants in Hsinchu, with the same urgency that the Soviet Politburo applied to factory number 183 in Kharkov. The scale is different, the geopolitical context is different, but the principle that industrial concentration is a strategic vulnerability and that distributing production capacity is a form of national defense is identical. The Soviet evacuation of 1941 is not a historical curiosity. It is the foundational case study for a problem that has only grown more relevant with time. The boring mill, the schiste de Vries, 18.7 tons, item 347 on the shipping manifest, eventually reached Nizhny Tagil, was reassembled, and resumed boring gun barrels for T-34s. By mid-1942, the Nizhny Tagil plant was producing T-34s at a rate that would eventually exceed the Kharkov plant's pre-war output. By 1943, Soviet tank production would surpass German tank production by a factor of roughly 3-to-1. The boring mill didn't win the war, but the decision to load it onto a freight car in October 1941 to ship it 1,000 kilometers east through a rail network already overloaded with military traffic, and to reassemble it in a snowfield in the Urals. That decision was one of the 1,000 small decisions that, aggregated, made the Soviet Union's survival possible. It is the kind of decision that doesn't appear in battle histories or generals' memoirs. It appears on a shipping manifest, in a line item, next to a weight figure, and it mattered more than most of the decisions that do get remembered. Chapter 10. The Myth of the Siberians. There is a phrase that echoes through the popular history of the Battle of Moscow with the authority of established fact: the Siberians are coming. The image it conjures is specific and vivid. Hardened winter warriors from the Soviet Far East, veterans of the frozen Manchurian border, transferred west in secret after the spy Richard Sorgi confirmed from Tokyo that Japan would not attack Siberia, arriving at the gates of Moscow just in time to hurl back the exhausted Wehrmacht. It is a magnificent story. It appears in virtually every popular history of the battle, from Alan Clark's Barbarossa in 1965 to countless television documentaries produced in the decades since. It has the satisfying narrative shape of a last-minute cavalry rescue, the fresh reserves arriving at the critical moment to save the day. There is only one problem with it. The archival evidence, examined at the level of individual divisions, shows that it is, in almost every particular, wrong. The detailed divisional analysis compiled by researchers at OperationBarbarossa.net, drawing on Soviet order of battle documents, formation records, and transfer orders, allows us to trace the movement of every Red Army division from the Far East, Transbaikal, Siberian, and Central Asian military districts during the second half of 1941. The total number of divisions transferred west from these districts after August 1941, the period during which Sorga's intelligence could theoretically have influenced the decision, is 14. Not 40, not 20, 14. Of these 14, 5 were sent to the Northwestern Front, or the Volkhov Front, defending Leningrad and the northern sector. 2 were small mountain cavalry divisions from Central Asia. 3 were tank or mechanized divisions that had only been formed in March or April of 1941 and had nothing to do with veteran Siberian garrisons. Of the remaining rifle divisions, exactly 4 were assigned to armies that could be even remotely linked to defending Moscow against Army Group Center. 4 divisions. The legend requires 10 to 20 elite Siberian formations arriving en masse. The archive produces 4 rifle divisions, and of those, only 2, the 32nd and 93rd, had a significant proportion of Siberian personnel. The timing doesn't support the legend either. Most sources place Sorga's key intelligence about Japanese intentions in October or November 1941. But the transfer data shows that the majority of available Eastern divisions had already been ordered west before this intelligence arrived. The 32nd Rifle Division was assigned to the 5th Army of the Western Front in October. Its movement orders preceded any plausible timeline for Sorga's intelligence to have influenced the decision. The transfers were driven not by espionage, but by the simpler, grimmer logic of national survival. The Soviet Union was losing divisions faster than it could form them, and every available formation had to be committed to the fight, regardless of what Japan might or might not do. The romantic narrative of Sorga's intelligence freeing up the Siberian reserves is appealing precisely because it connects 2 dramatic elements, a master spy and a last-minute rescue, into a single satisfying causal chain. But the causality doesn't hold. The divisions were moving before the intelligence arrived. There is one division that genuinely earned the Siberian reputation, and its story illuminates how the myth was constructed. The 32nd Rifle Division defended a position near the Borodino battlefield in October 1941, the same Borodino where the Russian army had fought Napoleon in 1812. The historical resonance of the location was powerful, and the division fought well. But the 32nd was formed not in Siberia, but in the Volga Military District in 1922. Only a portion of its personnel came from Western Siberian oblasts. It was a Siberian division in the sense that some of its men came from Siberia. It was not a Siberian division in the sense that the myth requires, a formation of specially trained, winter-hardened Far Eastern frontier troops. The distinction matters because it reveals the myth's construction method. A unit that fought well in winter conditions was retroactively labeled Siberian as an explanation for its effectiveness, regardless of its actual provenance. The label was applied by German soldiers who needed to explain why supposedly defeated Soviet forces kept appearing, and by Soviet propagandists who were happy to claim elite status for the Moscow defenders. Both sides, for different reasons, had incentives to perpetuate the story. The question that the Siberian myth obscures is the real question. If it wasn't elite Siberian divisions, what actually saved Moscow? The answer is the most massive wartime mobilization in human history. In the second half of 1941, the Soviet Union mobilized and deployed approximately 182 new rifle divisions, 43 militia rifle divisions, 62 tank brigades, 50 cavalry divisions, 55 rifle brigades, 21 naval rifle brigades, and a multitude of other formations. At establishment strength, the rifle divisions alone represent the mobilization of approximately 2 million men. These men were not winter warriors from the Manchurian border. They were farmers, factory workers, students, and office clerks from every Soviet republic: Ukraine, Belarus, the Russian heartland, the Caucasus, Central Asia, called up, given minimal training, issued whatever equipment was available, and sent to the front. Their average quality was low by professional military standards. Many had never fired a rifle before their mobilization, but there were 2 million of them, and they were enough. I find it professionally embarrassing that the Siberian myth has survived as long as it has. The divisional records that debunk it have been available in various forms since the post-Soviet archival openings of the 1990s. The detailed analysis is accessible online. The evidence is not ambiguous, and yet the myth persists in popular histories, in documentaries, in the general public's understanding of the battle. I suspect it endures because it is a better story than the truth. Elite Siberian warriors saved Moscow is dramatic, cinematic, and satisfying. A continent-spanning bureaucracy mobilized 2 million undertrained men from every corner of the Soviet Union and threw them into the fight is accurate, but it doesn't make for a good movie poster. The historian's obligation, though, is to the evidence, not to the story. And the evidence is clear. Moscow was saved by mass mobilization, not by elite transfers. The multitude of average Soviet soldiers from all over the USSR made up these units, and it was they, not the mythical Siberians, who stopped the German advance and launched the December counteroffensive. The role of the myth in both German and Soviet narratives is, I think, the most interesting aspect of this story from a historiographical perspective. For the German generals writing their memoirs in the 1950s, the Siberian myth served a specific self-exculpatory function. We weren't defeated by ordinary soldiers. We were defeated by elite winter troops transferred from a secret reserve. This framing preserved the image of German military superiority, while providing a plausible explanation for defeat that didn't involve admitting to logistical failure, command dysfunction, or the fundamental underestimation of Soviet resilience. For Soviet propagandists during and after the war, the myth served a different but complementary function. It enhanced the prestige of the Moscow defense by associating it with a dramatic intelligence operation and elite military formations. Both sides, for opposite reasons, preferred the myth to the reality. This convergence of interest, German self-justification and Soviet self-glorification pointing toward the same false narrative, is why the myth has been so resistant to correction. The persistence of historical misinformation is not, of course, unique to the Battle of Moscow. In 2026, as historians and journalists grapple with how digital age misinformation shapes public understanding of ongoing conflicts, the Siberian Division's myth serves as a cautionary example of a broader phenomenon, a dramatic false narrative outcompeting a complex true one. The mechanisms of persistence are identical across eras. The false story is simpler, more emotionally satisfying, and more easily transmitted than the true story, which is complicated, unglamorous, and requires the listener to sit with ambiguity. The Siberian myth requires one sentence to state and no effort to understand. The actual mobilization story requires pages of divisional data, formation records, and statistical analysis to establish. In the competition for narrative space, whether in a 1965 history book or a 2026 social media feed, simplicity beats accuracy almost every time. What the Siberian myth costs us, beyond factual accuracy, is the proper recognition of the people who actually saved Moscow. They were not elite troops. They were not specially trained. Many of them were barely trained at all. They came from farms and factories, from classrooms and offices, from every ethnic group and every region of the Soviet Union. They were given rifles, sometimes good ones, sometimes not, and assigned to divisions that existed, in many cases, only on paper until the men themselves arrived to fill the organizational frames. They were commanded by officers who were, in many cases, as inexperienced as the men they led. And they fought, not because they were winter-hardened Siberian warriors, but because they were Soviet citizens in a war of survival, and fighting was what was asked of them. Their story is less dramatic than the myth that has replaced it. It is also true, and truth, in the end, is the only thing a historian has to offer. The myth dies hard, and I don't expect this chapter to kill it. Documentaries will continue to show stock footage of fur-hatted soldiers marching through snow while a narrator intones about Siberian reserves. Popular histories will continue to cite Sorga's intelligence as the catalyst that freed up the far eastern divisions. The narrative is too useful, too satisfying, and too deeply embedded in the popular imagination to be dislodged by mere evidence. But the evidence exists. 14 divisions, 4 near Moscow, 2 with Siberian personnel, against the background of 182 newly mobilized rifle divisions drawn from the entire breadth of the Soviet Union. The numbers don't lie, the myth does, and the gap between them is a measure of how far popular history can drift from archival reality, when the false story is more compelling than the true one. Chapter 11, The November Gamble, Typhoon's Second Phase. The 30th of November, 1941, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, records in his war diary that the temperature has dropped to -45 degrees Celsius. Whether this specific reading is accurate or an exaggeration for the record is impossible to verify at this remove. Thermometer readings on the Eastern Front were notoriously inconsistent, varying with the instrument, the location, and the state of mind of the person recording them. What is not in dispute is that it was extraordinarily, lethally cold, and that on this same date, Bock reported to OKH in East Prussia that Army Group Center had no reserves whatsoever. Every division was committed. Every formation was on the line. There was nothing behind the front. No fresh units, no strategic reserve, no fallback force to plug a gap or exploit a breakthrough. The cupboard was empty, and Bock, knowing this, pushed forward anyway. The offensive continued. It continued not because the military situation justified it, but because the institutional culture of the German High Command had no mechanism for stopping. The second phase of Operation Typhoon began on approximately the 15th of November, when the ground finally froze hard enough to support vehicle movement after the 3-week paralysis of the Rasputitsa. The freeze was a double-edged gift. It restored mobility, but it brought with it temperatures that the Wehrmacht's men, vehicles, and weapons were catastrophically unprepared to endure. The German quartermaster system had not procured sufficient cold-weather clothing, a decision made in the spring of 1941, when the prevailing assumption was that the campaign would be concluded before winter. That assumption had been wrong for months, but the supply pipeline couldn't be retroactively corrected. Winter clothing existed in depots in Germany and occupied Poland. It could not be delivered to the front because the same railway system that couldn't deliver enough ammunition and fuel also couldn't deliver enough greatcoats and felt boots. German soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could scrounge: newspapers, straw, fabric stripped from the homes of Soviet civilians. The image of the German army as a precision military machine is difficult to reconcile with the reality of men stuffing newspaper into their summer-weight boots to prevent frostbite. The advance that resumed in mid-November was conducted by formations that bore little resemblance to the force that had crossed the Soviet border in June. German infantry divisions had been reduced to an average fighting strength of approximately 50 to 65% of establishment, and some were well below even that figure. The meaning of these percentages is worth translating into human terms. A division at 50% strength had lost roughly half its riflemen, its machine gunners, its mortar crews, its signalers. The men who remained were exhausted, many were sick, and virtually all were suffering from some degree of cold injury. The Panzer divisions, as we explored in Chapter 3, were operating with tank fleets at similar or worse levels of depletion. Army Group Center was attempting the most important offensive of the war, with roughly the combat power of an army group 2/3 its nominal size, stretched across a front of several hundred kilometers, supplied by a logistical system that was running at a chronic deficit, and equipped for a climate roughly 60 degrees warmer than the one it was actually experiencing. Despite all of this, the advance made progress. The 3rd Panzer Group pushed through Klin towards Solnechnogorsk, on the highway leading directly to Moscow from the northwest. Elements of the 7th Panzer Division advanced to within roughly 35 kilometers of the Kremlin. In the most dramatic moment of the entire campaign, forward units of the 2nd Panzer Division reached Krasnaya Polyana, a town just 29 kilometers from the center of Moscow, in late November. German officers reportedly observed the buildings of the Soviet capital through their field glasses. 29 kilometers. The distance is tantalizing, and every popular history lingers on it. But distance without combat power is merely geography. The units at Krasnaya Polyana were exhausted spearheads at the end of supply lines that could barely sustain them in a static position, let alone support a continued advance into a fortified city of 4 million people. They could see Moscow. They could not take it. The cold was destroying the German army's weapons as effectively as its men. At temperatures below -30°C, the recoil mechanisms of artillery pieces froze. The recoil fluid, a glycerin-water mix, solidified in the buffer cylinders, preventing the barrel from cycling after firing. Machine gun mechanisms jammed as lubricating oils thickened and then hardened. Rifle bolts froze shut. Soldiers had to urinate on them to thaw the actions, a desperate expedient that worked briefly before the fluid itself froze. Tank engines, if allowed to cool completely, could not be restarted. The lubricating oil solidified in the crankcase, and the starter motors lacked the power to turn over a frozen engine. Crews were ordered to run their engines for 15 minutes every 4 hours, day and night, consuming fuel that was already in critically short supply. The engines that weren't run seized. The ones that were run drained the fuel reserves. There was no good option. There was only a choice between two forms of paralysis. The frostbite statistics are, to me, more revealing than the combat casualty figures for understanding what the November offensive cost Germany. German medical reports record approximately 100,000 frostbite cases across the Eastern Front in the winter of 1941-42. A Panzer division could suffer up to 800 frostbite casualties in a single day during the worst cold periods. These were not men wounded by the enemy. They were men destroyed by a quartermaster's decision, taken months earlier in a warm office, based on an assumption that proved false, not to order winter clothing in sufficient quantities. Each frostbite casualty represented a trained soldier removed from the fighting line, often permanently. Severe frostbite, the kind caused by prolonged exposure at -30 or below without adequate protection, results in tissue death that frequently requires amputation. These men were not going back to their units. They were going to field hospitals, and then to convalescent facilities in the rear, and then, in many cases, to a lifetime of disability. The winter didn't kill them, the logistics system did. When I consider the second phase of Typhoon as a whole, the question I keep returning to is not, why did it fail? That answer is overdetermined, with more causes than any single narrative can contain. But rather, why was it attempted? The answer, I believe, lies in the concept that military theorists call the culminating point of the offensive, the precise moment when an attacking force has expended enough of its combat power that it transitions from a position of strength to one of vulnerability. By mid-November, Army Group Center had passed its culminating point. The evidence was everywhere, in the strength returns, in the vehicle status reports, in the frostbite casualty figures, in the ammunition expenditure rates that exceeded resupply rates. Bach's own diary entries from this period oscillate between grim realism about his force's condition and a compulsive forward momentum that reads less like strategy than like the institutional inability to stop. He knew. His diary shows he knew. He reported to OKH that he had no reserves, and he continued to advance because the German command culture of 1941 contained no mechanism, psychological, institutional, or procedural, for a senior commander to say, "We cannot continue," and attempting to do so will result in catastrophe. The culminating point concept, now a formal element of modern military doctrine taught at every major war college, finds its textbook illustration in the Moscow approaches of late November 1941. The German force was still moving forward. It was still taking ground. Individual units were still achieving local successes, but the overall offensive had crossed the threshold from advance to overextension, from concentration to dispersion, from strength to vulnerability. The men at Krasnaya Polyana could see the Kremlin, but they could not be reinforced, resupplied, or supported. They were a fingertip at the end of an arm that was already overextended. And behind them, along the entire 200-plus kilometer arc of the German front around Moscow, there was nothing. No reserves, no second echelon, no fallback position. Every unit was on the line. The front was a shell, hard and seemingly intact from the outside, hollow within. On the 1st of December, a Soviet force appeared that signaled what was coming. The First Shock Army, newly formed, fresh, equipped with winter clothing, counterattacked at the Moscow-Volga Canal bridgehead, where elements of the German 7th Panzer Division had established a precarious crossing. The counterattack drove the Germans back across the canal. It was a relatively small action, a local engagement that didn't alter the map significantly. But it was the first time in the Moscow campaign that a major Soviet formation had attacked and succeeded in pushing the Germans backward. It was a preview. Behind the First Shock Army, along the entire front, more Soviet formations were concentrating, invisible to German intelligence, which had failed to detect the scale of the buildup. The shell was about to be struck, and there was nothing inside it to absorb the blow. 29 kilometers. I keep staring at that number. It is the distance that separates the closest German approach from the heart of Moscow. In a modern car, assuming average traffic, you could drive it in roughly 40 minutes. It is less than the distance most people commute to work. And it was absolutely, irrevocably unbridgeable. Not because of any single factor, but because everything had converged. The fuel was gone. The tanks were broken. The men were freezing. The railways couldn't deliver. The reserves didn't exist. The enemy was reinforcing. The 29 kilometers were not a military distance. They were a measurement of the gap between what the Wehrmacht had been asked to do and what it was physically capable of doing. And that gap, on the 1st of December, 1941, was about to be filled, not with German soldiers advancing, but with Soviet soldiers attacking. The counteroffensive was 4 days away, and nobody on the German side saw it coming. Chapter 12. The T-34 and the Matilda, an unlikely alliance. Sometime in November 1941, at a Soviet tank unit's rear assembly area, a group of tank crews receives a consignment of new vehicles. The tanks are not T-34s. They are not KV-1s. They are Matilda Mark IIs, British infantry tanks, manufactured by the Vulcan Foundry in Newton-le-Willows, Lancashire, shipped across the Arctic Ocean to Archangel, through waters patrolled by German U-boats, transferred to Soviet broad-gauge rail cars, and hauled south to the Moscow front. The tanks arrive with serial numbers stamped in English. Their instrument panels are labeled in English. Their operating manuals, if they arrived at all, are in English. The Soviet crews who will fight in them have been trained on T-26s, or BT-7s, vehicles with completely different layouts, different controls, different ammunition, and different mechanical characteristics. The familiarization period is, by necessity, almost non-existent. Some crews learn to operate the Matildas while transiting to the front on flat cars. The phrase on-the-job training has rarely been applied so literally. The presence of British-built tanks in the defense of Moscow is one of the most consistently overlooked aspects of the battle, and I want to explain why I think it matters before we get into the specifics. The Battle of Moscow is almost universally presented as a German-Soviet binary, a duel between two armies on one front, with no significant external factors. The Soviet Union fought alone. The Western Allies were not yet engaged on the ground. The battle was decided by Soviet blood and Russian winter. This framing is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that distorts our understanding. By December 1941, at least 8 Soviet tank battalions equipped with British Matilda and Valentine tanks were operating on the Moscow front. They were not a dominant element of Soviet armored strength, but they were present, and their presence mattered, because they were filling a gap that could not have been filled any other way at that specific moment. The gap existed because of the industrial evacuation we examined in the previous chapter. Soviet tank factories were in transit, or being reassembled in the Urals. T-34 production was effectively at zero during the critical November-December period. The tanks defending Moscow were drawn from pre-evacuation stocks, from repair depots that were cannibalizing damaged vehicles to produce working ones, and from Lend-Lease deliveries. The Matildas and Valentines were, in this context, not a luxury, but a necessity. The only source of new armored vehicles available to the Soviet command at the precise moment when their domestic production had temporarily ceased. To dismiss their contribution, as Soviet historiography systematically did for ideological reasons, is to misunderstand the arithmetic of the Moscow defense. Every tank mattered, and some of those tanks were built in Lancashire. The Matilda Mark II was, by the standards of the Eastern Front in 1941, an odd machine. Its armor was thick, up to 78 millimeters on the frontal surfaces, actually heavier than the T-34's maximum of 45 millimeters. This made it resistant to most German anti-tank weapons of the period. The 37 millimeter and 50 millimeter guns that constituted the bulk of German anti-armor capability could not penetrate the Matilda's front at combat ranges. In a defensive role, where the tank could be positioned in a hull-down prepared position and absorb incoming fire while its infantry support dealt with the attackers, the Matilda was surprisingly effective. But its weaknesses were severe. Its engine, a pair of AEC diesels producing a combined 87 horsepower, moved 26.9 tons of tank at a maximum speed of roughly 24 kilometers per hour. The power-to-weight ratio of approximately 3.2 horsepower per ton was abysmal by comparison with the T-34's 18.9. The Matilda was slow. It couldn't keep up with mobile operations, and its turret armament, a 2-pounder gun firing a solid shot of approximately 40 millimeters diameter, was adequate against German armor in 1941, but lacked a high-explosive round capable of engaging infantry and soft targets effectively. The Soviet crews who operated these vehicles had to contend not just with the Matilda's mechanical limitations, but with the friction of operating a foreign weapon system under combat conditions. Controls were arranged differently from Soviet tanks. Instrumentation was in English, a language few Soviet tankers read. Maintenance procedures differed from those the crews had been trained on. The 2-pounder ammunition was not interchangeable with any Soviet gun. Spare parts had to come from Britain through the Arctic convoys, a supply chain measured in months rather than days. When a Matilda broke down on the Moscow front, the chances of obtaining the correct replacement part in any reasonable time frame were essentially nil. Soviet workshops improvised, adapting Soviet components where possible, fabricating replacements from available materials, and in many cases, simply cannibalizing one broken Matilda to keep another running. The Matildas that fought at Moscow were kept operational by a combination of British engineering, Soviet ingenuity, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept that a working tank should be abandoned for want of a gasket. It fascinates me how the historiographical politics of Lend-Lease have distorted the factual record. Soviet historiography minimized Lend-Lease throughout the Cold War. To acknowledge significant Western material support would have undermined the narrative of Soviet self-sufficiency that was central to the regime's legitimacy. Western historians, particularly during the Cold War, sometimes overcorrected in the opposite direction, exaggerating Lend-Lease's importance to counter the Soviet minimization. The academic consensus, as it has developed through more recent and less politically motivated scholarship, lands somewhere in between. Lend-Lease was not decisive at Moscow, but it was significant. The British tanks were not the weapon that stopped the German advance, but they were a weapon that was available when the domestic alternative was temporarily absent, and their contribution, measured not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in defensive positions held, counterattacks supported, and the simple morale boost of knowing that new tanks were arriving from somewhere, mattered more than either Soviet or Western Cold War narratives were willing to admit. The logistics of getting a Matilda from Lancashire to the Moscow front were, in themselves, an extraordinary feat. The tanks were loaded onto cargo ships in British ports, Liverpool, Glasgow, and sailed to Archangel via the Arctic convoy route, a journey of roughly 2,000 nautical miles through some of the most dangerous waters in the world. German U-boats, surface raiders, and aircraft based in occupied Norway attacked the convoys with increasing effectiveness throughout 1941 and 42. Each Matilda that arrived in Archangel represented not just 26.9 tons of British engineering, but the successful passage of a merchantman through waters where ships were being sunk on a regular basis. From Archangel, the tanks were loaded onto Soviet rail cars and shipped south, a journey of roughly 1,000 kilometers to the Moscow area. The total transit time from factory to front could be measured in months. Each tank's arrival was, in a small way, a minor miracle of industrial cooperation between two nations that had been ideological enemies for 20 years. There is an irony in this that I find almost novelistic in its neatness. Winston Churchill had spent the better part of 2 decades opposing Bolshevism with a vigor that bordered on obsession. He had advocated for military intervention against the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918 and 19. He had described communism in language that left no ambiguity about his hostility. And now, in the autumn of 1941, his government was shipping British tanks to defend the Soviet capital. The tanks bore serial numbers stamped in the factories of Lancashire by British workers, many of them women, working shifts in the wartime production lines. These workers had no idea their products would end up defending Moscow. The global nature of the Second World War's production networks is something that popular history tends to understate. A rivet set in Newton-le-Willows ended up in a tank that stopped a German advance outside the town of Istra, west of Moscow. The connection between the two events, the rivet and the battle, spans thousands of miles, two national economies, and the institutional machinery of an alliance that was barely 3 months old. The Matildas and Valentines fought through the defensive battles of November and early December, and then participated, to a limited extent, in the counteroffensive that began on the 5th of December. Their role in the counteroffensive was constrained by their slow speed. The Matilda simply could not keep pace with the operational tempo of a mobile advance. But in the defensive role, holding positions on the Moscow approaches, while faster Soviet formations maneuvered around them, the British tanks performed a function out of proportion to their numbers. 8 tank battalions is not a large force, but 8 tank battalions, equipped with heavily armored vehicles, positioned at critical defensive points, represented a meaningful addition to a front where every tank mattered, and where, as we've discussed, Soviet domestic tank production had temporarily ceased. The coalition dimension of the Moscow defense is, I believe, an important corrective to the purely bilateral framing that dominates most accounts. Moscow was not saved by Soviet forces alone. It was saved by Soviet forces supplemented by British equipment, delivered at enormous risk through Arctic waters by British and Allied merchant sailors. The contribution was modest in absolute terms. Hundreds of tanks, not thousands. But it arrived at the moment of maximum Soviet vulnerability, and it filled a gap that could not have been filled domestically. In 2026, the challenges of coalition logistics, shipping equipment from one country to another, with incompatible systems, different languages, and compressed training timelines, define the NATO-Ukraine military relationship. Ukrainian crews learning to operate German Leopard 2s with German-language fire control systems are the direct descendants of Soviet crews struggling with English-language gauges in Matilda turrets in December 1941. The technology evolves. The human problem of operating foreign equipment under combat stress does not. Next 5 chapters. Approximately 2,000 words per chapter, 10 paragraphs, each paragraph around 3 to 4 sentences. Chapter 13, The Tula Anvil, the city that would not break. The 29th of October, 1941. Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army is approaching the city of Tula from the south, along the road from Orel. Tula sits roughly 170 kilometers south of Moscow, and its capture is essential to the operational plan for Typhoon's 2nd phase. Without Tula, Guderian cannot swing his forces northeast to encircle the Soviet capital from the south. The city's population in 1941 is approximately 300,000. Its primary industry, dating back to the 18th century, is the manufacture of weapons. The Tula arms plant is one of the oldest and most productive armaments factories in Russia, and in 1941 it is producing SVT-40 semi-automatic rifles, among other weapons, for the Red Army. The factory workers who build these rifles are about to pick them up and use them. The defense of Tula was organized around a patchwork force that no textbook would consider adequate. The 50th Army, initially under General Ermakov, and from the 22nd of November under Lieutenant General Ivan Bolden, was the primary military formation responsible for the city's defense. But the 50th Army was itself a battered remnant. It had been caught in the Bryansk Encirclement in October and had suffered severe losses breaking out. Its divisions were under strength, its equipment was depleted, and its organizational coherence was fragile. To supplement the 50th Army, the Tula City Defense Committee organized a workers' regiment drawn from the arms factory employees, miners, and railway workers. These were men who understood firearms intimately. They manufactured them, but whose knowledge of infantry tactics was essentially zero. The production log of the Tula arms plant from October 1941 contains a detail that I find extraordinary in its compressed symbolism. On the same ledger page, serial numbers appear in 2 parallel columns, one for outgoing production, the rifles being shipped to the front, and one for militia armament, the rifles being issued to the factory's own workers' regiment. The factory was simultaneously arming the army and arming itself. The older Mosin Nagant rifles went to the militia. The newer SVT-40s continued to flow to frontline units. Production didn't stop when the Germans appeared on the horizon. It continued, under bombardment, under the threat of encirclement, because stopping production would have meant the front got fewer rifles and the militia got none. Guderian's first assault on Tula was launched on the 30th of October, and it failed. The details of the fighting are recorded in both the 2nd Panzer Army's combat reports and the 50th Army's after-action assessments, and the two accounts, predictably, tell different stories. Guderian's memoir attributes the failure primarily to fuel shortages and cold, external factors beyond his control. Soviet sources celebrate the workers' militia as a spontaneous patriotic uprising that hurled back the German panzers through sheer revolutionary spirit. The truth lies in the uncomfortable space between these two narratives. Guderian's forces were fuel-starved and mechanically degraded after the long drive from Kiev and then from Orel. And the defenders of Tula did fight with determination that exceeded what their training and equipment would have predicted. Both factors operated simultaneously, and separating them into a clean causal hierarchy is neither possible nor honest. The SVT-40, the rifle that the Tula factory was producing and that many of its worker defenders carried, deserves a technical note because it illustrates a specific irony of the Tula defense. The SVT-40 was a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle that was technically advanced for its era, lighter and faster firing than the bolt-action Mosin Nagant that equipped most Soviet infantry. But it was notoriously sensitive to dirt, cold, and improper maintenance. Its gas system required regular cleaning that frontline soldiers, in the chaos of combat, often neglected. The factory workers who carried SVT-40s into battle understood the weapon's mechanisms better than almost anyone on the front. They had built them, tested them, repaired them. They knew exactly where the gas port clogged, exactly how the recoil spring weakened in cold weather, exactly which tolerances mattered. They knew the rifle's flaws as intimately as its strengths. Whether this knowledge translated into better combat performance is unknowable. But there is something almost surreal about a man who machined a rifle barrel on Monday, picking up a finished rifle on Tuesday, and defending his factory with it on Wednesday. Bolden's assumption of command of the 50th Army on the 22nd of November brought a degree of professional military leadership to Tula's defense that had been lacking in the chaotic first weeks. The Osprey Campaign Study, Moscow, 1941, identifies Bolden's defense of Tula as the only major Soviet defensive success during Typhoon, a judgment that carries considerable weight given the overall pattern of Soviet defensive failure during the German offensive. Bolden organized the defense in depth, utilizing the city's urban terrain, its factories, railway yards, and residential blocks, as a series of strong points that canalized the German advance into kill zones. The German advantage in armor was partially neutralized by the close terrain. Tanks are vulnerable in urban environments, where they cannot maneuver freely and where defenders can engage them at short range from concealed positions. The strategic significance of Tula's defense extends far beyond the city itself. Had Tula fallen, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army would have had a viable route to approach Moscow from the south, and potentially link up with the 4th Panzer Army attacking from the northwest. The encirclement of Moscow, the stated objective of Typhoon's 2nd phase, depended on this link-up. Without Tula, the southern arm of the encirclement couldn't close. The workers of the Tula arms plant, without knowing the full operational picture, were preventing the encirclement of a city of 4 million people. This is the kind of strategic consequence that is invisible at the ground level. A factory worker fighting from a rooftop has no awareness that his position is the hinge on which a continental strategy turns. But it was. It strikes me that the defense of Tula represents something that modern military theory has come to recognize formally, but that in 1941 was simply an emergent reality. The power of urban terrain defended by armed civilians who know the ground. The workers of Tula knew every street, every factory building, every railway siding. They didn't need maps. They had spent their working lives in the terrain they were now defending. This intimate knowledge of the physical environment, combined with even rudimentary weapons and minimal tactical training, created a defensive capability that mechanized forces found disproportionately difficult to overcome. The principle has been observed repeatedly in modern conflicts, from the defense of Stalingrad to the urban fighting in Aleppo, Mosul, and Mariupol. Tula was an early, untheorized example of a phenomenon that would become a defining feature of 20th and 21st century warfare. The Tula arms plant continued producing weapons throughout the siege. Output declined. Bombardment disrupted power supplies. Workers were pulled from production lines to man defensive positions. Raw material deliveries were interrupted. But production did not reach zero. Rifles, machine gun components, and ammunition continued to flow from the factory, even as German shells fell on the city. The daily output figures during the siege are not, to my knowledge, available in a disaggregated form in the English-language literature. But the fact that production continued at all, under direct military threat, speaks to both the stubbornness of the workforce and the organizational resilience of a factory that had been producing weapons for over 2 centuries. The Tula arms plant had survived Napoleon. It would survive Guderian. Guderian never took Tula. His forces bypassed it, attempted to encircle it, and were eventually driven back by the December counteroffensive. The city was awarded the title Hero City after the war, one of 12 Soviet cities to receive the designation for outstanding defense. The Workers' Regiment was disbanded, and its surviving members returned to the production lines. The rifles they had carried were cleaned, inspected, and in many cases, returned to the outgoing production stream. The men who had defended the factory went back to building the weapons that other men would use. It is the kind of quiet, circular conclusion that resists dramatic narration. No grand speeches, no victory parades, just men returning to their lathes, picking up where they left off, building the next rifle for the next soldier who would need it. Chapter 14, November 7, the parade that shouldn't have happened. The 7th of November, 1941, Red Square, Moscow. Snow is falling. The temperature is well below freezing. German forces are positioned less than 100 kilometers to the west, close enough that the sound of artillery, on a still day, can sometimes be heard in the city's outer districts. The Luftwaffe has been bombing Moscow nightly for weeks, and on this morning, the Soviet government is holding a military parade. Soldiers are marching across the cobblestones of Red Square, past the Lenin Mausoleum, past the Kremlin walls, in the annual celebration of the October Revolution, the same parade that has been held every year since 1918. The soldiers are carrying rifles. Some of them are towing artillery pieces. Some of them will march directly from the parade through the city's western exits and continue, without pause, to the defense lines. The parade is not a ceremony followed by deployment. It is a ceremony that is deployment, a political event and a troop movement fused into a single act. The planning file for the parade, held in Moscow's Central Archives, includes a memo from the NKVD Chief of Parade Security detailing anti-aircraft preparations. The Luftwaffe threat was real. German bombers had hit Moscow multiple times in the preceding weeks, and a massed formation of troops in an open square represented an ideal target. The memo lists the placement of additional anti-aircraft batteries around the Kremlin, specifically for November 7th, and notes that fighter squadrons would be on standing alert throughout the event. The parade was planned with the explicit understanding that it might be attacked from the air. Stalin knew this. The military commanders who organized the parade knew this. The soldiers who marched in it knew this. And they proceeded anyway, because the parade's purpose was not military efficiency. It was strategic communication. The message, directed at the Soviet population, at the German enemy, and at the watching world, was simple. Moscow stands. The government has not fled. The fight continues. Stalin's speech from the Lenin Mausoleum that morning invoked not Marx or Lenin, but the military heroes of Russian national history. Alexander Nevsky, who defeated the Teutonic Knights in the 13th century. Dmitry Donskoy, who defeated the Mongols in the 14th. Mikhail Kutuzov, who defeated Napoleon in the 19th. Alexander Suvorov, the great 18th century general who never lost a battle. The choice of references was deliberate and strategically consequential. By reaching past the communist revolution to the deeper strata of Russian national identity, Stalin was reframing the war from an ideological conflict, Bolshevism against fascism, into a civilizational survival war, Russia against invaders. This rhetorical pivot broadened the war's appeal beyond committed party members to include the vast majority of the Soviet population, whose loyalty was to their homeland rather than to Marxist-Leninist theory. The speech didn't just rally the troops, it redefined what they were fighting for. There is a source problem with the visual record of the November 7th parade that I think is worth noting, because it illustrates a broader challenge with Soviet-era documentation. Some of the most famous film footage of the parade, the images that appear in virtually every documentary about the Battle of Moscow, was actually filmed during a later restaging. The original filming conditions, heavy snow, low light, the limitations of 1940s camera equipment, produced footage of poor technical quality. Soviet filmmakers subsequently refilmed portions of the parade under better conditions, creating a visual record that is partly authentic and partly reconstructed. The event happened. The footage of it is partly fabricated. This creates a peculiar archival paradox. The most iconic images of one of the war's most symbolically important events are, in part, a reenactment staged for the cameras. The historian must work with this, acknowledging the event's reality while flagging the visual record's unreliability. The logistical dimension of the parade is easily overlooked, but genuinely interesting. Moving parade units directly from Red Square to the defense lines, approximately 100 kilometers to the west, required pre-positioning supplies, ammunition, and transport along the parade route's exit corridors. The parade was, in effect, a military movement disguised as a ceremony. Units marched into the square from staging areas to the east, crossed Red Square, exited through the western exits, and continued along pre-planned routes toward their assigned defensive sectors. The timing had to be coordinated with both the ceremonial requirements of the parade and the operational requirements of the front. Units needed to arrive at their positions before nightfall, which in early November in the Moscow region comes by approximately 4 in the afternoon. The logistical staff who managed this dual-purpose event receive no mention in the heroic narratives. They should. I confess that this is the chapter where I most want to set aside the historian's skepticism and simply admire the audacity of the decision. To parade your army through the center of your threatened capital, in full view of the enemy's reconnaissance capability, under the known threat of aerial bombardment, at a moment when the outcome of the battle remains genuinely uncertain. This is either lunacy or genius. It was probably both simultaneously. The risk was real. A successful Luftwaffe attack on the parade would have been a propaganda catastrophe of the first order. The entire Soviet leadership, massed Soviet troops, and thousands of Moscow civilians killed or scattered in a single bombing raid. The fact that no attack materialized, German bombers were reportedly grounded by weather, though accounts vary, does not diminish the courage of the decision. Stalin rolled the dice. The dice came up in his favor, but they were real dice, with real consequences, and the willingness to throw them reveals something about the Soviet leadership's understanding of how morale functions as a strategic asset. German intelligence reports from the period note the parade with evident concern. The event demonstrated that the Soviet government remained functional, present in the capital, and sufficiently confident, or sufficiently reckless, to stage a public spectacle under the shadow of the Wehrmacht's advance. For German intelligence analysts trying to assess the likelihood of Soviet political collapse, the November 7th parade was an unwelcome data point. It contradicted the assumption, embedded in German strategic thinking since June, that the Soviet system was fragile and would shatter under sufficient military pressure. The system had not shattered. It was holding parades. The soldiers who marched through Red Square that morning and continued directly to the front carried with them the psychological weight of the event. The knowledge that they had marched through the capital, past the walls of the Kremlin, watched by their supreme commander, and were now going to fight. Whether this knowledge made them better soldiers is impossible to quantify. Morale is not a metric that appears in order of battle calculations or strength returns. But every military commander in history has understood that men who believe their cause is recognized and their sacrifice is witnessed fight differently from men who feel forgotten. The parade told the soldiers of the Moscow defense that their government was watching, that their city was still theirs, and that the fight they were entering had been publicly consecrated by the highest authority in the land. It was, in the modern terminology that has emerged from the study of information warfare, an act of performative resilience, a public demonstration of defiance designed to shape perception and thereby shape reality. The modern parallel is difficult to avoid. In February 2022, as Russian armored columns approached Kiev, President Zelensky recorded a series of selfie videos from the streets of the Ukrainian capital, informal, handheld, unmistakably located in Kiev, that served precisely the same function as Stalin's November 7th parade. The message was identical. The leader is here. The capital stands. The government has not fled. The medium was different, a smartphone camera instead of a military parade, but the strategic logic was unchanged. Both acts were designed to communicate resilience to a domestic audience, determination to an enemy, and relevance to an international community of observers. Both carried genuine personal risk, and both succeeded in their primary purpose, preventing the psychological collapse that a leader's departure would have signaled. The parade ended. The soldiers marched west. The snow continued to fall on Red Square, covering the footprints and the tire tracks with a fresh layer of white. Within hours, the square was empty again, returned to the silence of a city under siege. But the event had done its work. It had told Moscow and Russia and the world that the fight was not over. In a war where morale was as consequential as ammunition, the November 7th parade was a strategic act of the first importance, not because it altered the military balance, which it did not, but because it altered the psychological balance, which, in the long mathematics of attrition warfare, may have mattered more. The soldiers who marched that morning would fight through November and into December, through the final crisis of the German advance, and into the counteroffensive that would drive the Wehrmacht back from the gates of the capital. Some of them would not survive to see the new year. But they had marched through Red Square, in the snow, past the Kremlin walls, and they knew, whatever happened next, that their city had not surrendered. Chapter 15, December 5, the counterattack nobody expected. The 4th of December, 1941. In Franz Halder's diary, the document that has been our most reliable seismograph of German command thinking throughout this story, the entries for this date still discuss the potential resumption of German offensive operations. The tone is not optimistic, exactly, but it is forward-looking. Army Group Center is exhausted, yes. Reserves are non-existent, yes. But the language is still the language of an attacking force considering its next move, not a defending force bracing for impact. There is no mention of incoming Soviet reserves, no assessment of a potential counteroffensive, no contingency planning for a Soviet attack. Bach's report to OKH on the same date acknowledges that his forces are no longer capable of carrying out attacks. But even this admission frames the problem as a temporary pause, not a terminal condition. 24 hours later, the character of Halder's entries will change dramatically. The Soviet counteroffensive began on the 5th of December on the Kalinin front, north of Moscow, and expanded on the 6th with Zhukov's western front joining the assault along the entire arc of the German position. The attack was launched without numerical superiority, in total manpower, a fact that contradicts one of the most common assumptions about counteroffensives. The Soviet forces committed to the operation totaled approximately 1,100,000 men, facing an Army Group Center of roughly 1,700,000. But the raw numbers are misleading. Many of the German divisions were at 50 to 65% strength. Most lacked winter clothing, functional vehicles, and adequate ammunition. The Soviet formations, while often undertrained, were at full establishment strength, equipped with winter clothing, and, critically, had not been fighting continuously since June. The advantage was not in total numbers, but in fresh numbers, concentrated at specific points against an overextended enemy with no reserves to shift. The intelligence failure that preceded the counteroffensive is, to me, the most striking aspect of the entire event. Soviet forces had been concentrating behind the front for weeks. New armies moving into position, reserve formations assembling in forests east of Moscow, supply depots being established. The signs were there. Increased rail traffic east of Moscow was detectable. Prisoner interrogations from late November mentioned new Soviet units. Soviet radio traffic patterns shifted in ways that, in retrospect, clearly indicated a major operation being prepared. And yet, there is no evidence in the German command records, not in Bach's war diary, not in Halder's diary, not in Army Group Center's intelligence summaries, of anyone connecting these indicators into a coherent assessment that a counteroffensive was imminent. The dots existed, nobody connected them. It strikes me as profoundly unlikely that the signals were truly invisible. The German intelligence apparatus on the Eastern Front was degraded by December, overworked, understaffed, hampered by poor aerial reconnaissance in winter weather. But it was not blind. The more plausible explanation is not that the intelligence was absent, but that the interpretation was wrong. The German command, trapped in an offensive mindset that had persisted since June, could not conceive that an enemy they had been defeating for 5 months, an enemy that had lost millions of men, thousands of tanks, and vast stretches of territory, could suddenly muster the strength and the will to attack. This was not a failure of intelligence collection. It was a failure of intelligence interpretation, a cognitive failure rooted in the assumption that a beaten enemy stays beaten. The assumption was wrong, and on the 5th of December, the consequences of being wrong arrived in the form of Soviet ski troops emerging from tree lines at dawn, in temperatures that froze the recoil mechanisms of German guns. The initial Soviet attacks achieved varying degrees of success along the front. In some sectors, German units were caught completely off guard and overrun. In others, the German defense held, at least temporarily, against Soviet formations whose tactical proficiency was limited by their recent mobilization and minimal training. The counteroffensive was not a single coordinated blow. It was a series of attacks along a front of several hundred kilometers, delivered with uneven force and uneven skill. Soviet commanders, many of them as inexperienced as their troops, made mistakes. Attacks were launched frontally against prepared positions, when flanking movements would have been more effective. Artillery support was sometimes poorly coordinated with infantry advances. The counteroffensive succeeded, not because of tactical brilliance, but because it hit an enemy that had nothing left. No reserves, no depth, no capacity to absorb even a moderately competent attack. The German response in the first 72 hours ranged from confusion to panic. Some units retreated without authorization, abandoning equipment and positions. Others stood and fought from positions they could not hold, suffering casualties that accelerated the already critical manpower shortage. The command structure strained under the shock. Communication lines were cut by Soviet advances, unit boundaries dissolved as retreating formations intermingled, and the orderly German chain of command frayed into a collection of isolated units, making local decisions with no awareness of the larger picture. Bach's war diary entries for December 6th through 8th read like a commander watching a controlled organization disintegrate in real time, each entry recording new crises, new breaches, new requests for reinforcements that he does not have. Hitler's response, the order to hold all positions and forbid unauthorized retreat, issued in stages over December and early January, has been the subject of intense historiographical debate for 8 decades. The traditional interpretation, advanced by many of the German generals in their post-war memoirs, is that Hitler's halt order prevented a general rout, that without the iron discipline of the no-retreat command, Army Group Center would have disintegrated into a chaotic retreat resembling Napoleon's withdrawal from Moscow in 1812. The revisionist interpretation, advanced by historians who have examined the casualty figures and operational records more closely, argues that the halt order also trapped German formations in indefensible positions and caused unnecessary losses, that a controlled withdrawal to defensible positions would have preserved more combat power for future operations. Both interpretations contain truth. The halt order probably did prevent a complete collapse. It also probably did cause unnecessary casualties. Disentangling the two effects is impossible with the evidence available. The question that Zhukov's memoirs claim, and Stavka records complicate, is, who conceived the counteroffensive? Zhukov presents it as his plan, proposed to Stalin and accepted. Stavka documents suggest a more collaborative process, with significant input from Boris Shaposhnikov and Alexander Vasilevsky of the General Staff. The attribution question has been debated in Russian military historiography for decades and will not be resolved here. What can be said is that the counteroffensive was not a single individual's inspiration. It was the product of a command system that, despite its brutalities and inefficiencies, was capable of identifying an enemy's culminating point and organizing a response to exploit it. The Soviet command in December 1941 was not brilliant. It was adequate. Against an enemy that had exhausted itself, adequate was sufficient. The Soviet use of ski battalions in the counteroffensive deserves mention as a specific tactical innovation that exploited the environmental conditions the Germans were suffering under. These units, trained to operate on skis in deep snow, carrying light weapons and minimal equipment, could move cross-country at 10 to 15 kilometers per hour, through terrain that road-bound German units considered impassable. They infiltrated behind German lines through forests, cut supply routes, attacked rear area installations, and created the impression of being surrounded that accelerated German withdrawals. Against German infantry struggling through knee-deep snow at 2 to 3 kilometers per hour, the ski battalions possessed an almost absurd mobility advantage. The technology involved was ancient: wooden skis, fur clothing, light automatic weapons, but its application against a mechanized enemy immobilized by winter conditions was devastating. The counteroffensive of December 5, 1941, was the first major strategic defeat suffered by the Wehrmacht in the Second World War. It did not destroy Army Group Center. It did not liberate vast territories. It did not end the war. But it did something that no previous event in the war had accomplished. It demonstrated that the German army could be pushed backward by a force it had been defeating for 5 months. The psychological impact on the German military, on the Soviet population, on neutral observers around the world was disproportionate to the territorial gains, which were modest. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, which had survived the failures of the Battle of Britain and the stalemate of the Atlantic, did not survive the Soviet counteroffensive at Moscow. After December 5th, the war would be fought in the shadow of a new understanding. Germany could lose. Chapter 16, The Reckoning. Generals fall, lines hold. The 19th of December, 1941. On this date, 12 days into the Soviet counteroffensive, and on the same calendar day that the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is dominating the headlines of the world's newspapers, Adolf Hitler dismisses Walther von Brauchitsch from the position of commander-in-chief of the German army and assumes the role himself. Brauchitsch had submitted his resignation on the 7th of December, citing health reasons. He had suffered a heart attack in November. But the health rationale was a formality. Brauchitsch was being removed because the Moscow offensive had failed, and someone had to bear the institutional responsibility. Hitler's assumption of direct army command was not merely a personnel change. It was a structural transformation of the German military system that would have consequences far beyond the immediate crisis. The cascade of dismissals that followed Brauchitsch's removal constitutes the most comprehensive purge of senior German military leadership since the Blomberg-Fritsch affair of 1938. Bach was relieved of command of Army Group Center on the 18th of December, officially for health reasons, actually for the failure of Typhoon. Guderian was dismissed on the 26th of December for ordering unauthorized retreats that contradicted Hitler's halt order. Hoepner, commanding the 4th Panzer Army, was dismissed on the 8th of January 1942 and subjected to a punitive humiliation unprecedented in Prussian-German military tradition. He was stripped of his rank, his pension, and his right to wear his uniform. The message was unmistakable. Failure would not be tolerated. Independent judgment would not be tolerated. The professional military leadership of the German army was being brought to heel. The post-war German generals' narrative of these dismissals, crystallized in the memoirs that proliferated in the 1950s, frames them as the irrational punishment of competent commanders by an incompetent political leader. This narrative has been enormously influential. It is also, based on the archival evidence, considerably more self-serving than accurate. Some of the dismissed generals had made errors. Some of their unauthorized retreats were tactically necessary, but procedurally insubordinate. The neat division of the story into competent generals versus incompetent Hitler is a construction built by the surviving generals to protect their professional reputations. The archive presents a messier picture, a command system in which poor decisions were made at every level, from the Führer headquarters to the divisional command posts, and in which the distribution of blame after the fact was determined not by an honest assessment of responsibility, but by who survived to write the memoir. I note that every German general who published a memoir after the war found a way to blame Hitler for Moscow. Guderian blamed Hitler's Kiev diversion and halt order. Bach's diary implies that he was constrained by unrealistic demands from above. Halder's diary presents himself as the voice of professional reason, overruled by political irrationality. None blamed himself. None blamed the institutional culture that produced the overconfidence, the logistical miscalculations, and the inability to accept bad news that characterized the German command throughout 1941. I find this unanimity suspicious. When every participant in a failure blames the same external factor, it usually means the actual causes are more distributed and more uncomfortable than any individual is willing to admit. The structural consequence of Hitler's assumption of army command was more significant than the individual dismissals. The German military system had traditionally relied on the OKH, the Army High Command, as an institutional buffer between the political leadership and the operational commanders in the field. The OKH staff processed information, coordinated planning, allocated resources, and, crucially, mediated between the Supreme Commander's strategic desires and the theater commander's operational realities. When Hitler eliminated Brauchitsch and assumed OKH's role, he removed this buffer. Every operational decision now had to flow through one man, a man who held interminable evening conferences, slept late, demanded involvement in tactical minutiae, and was constitutionally incapable of delegating authority. The bottleneck this created would prove increasingly fatal as the war expanded in scope and complexity. Stalingrad, in particular, would demonstrate what happens when every decision, down to the battalion level, requires the personal approval of a supreme commander who is physically and mentally incapable of processing the volume of decisions required. The casualty figures for the Eastern Front through the end of 1941 provide the statistical framework for understanding the scale of the crisis that produced the command purge. German Army casualties from the 22nd of June to the 31st of December 1941, killed, wounded, missing, and frostbite cases, totaled approximately 830,000 across all sectors. This represents roughly 1/4 of the total force committed to Barbarossa. The replacement system could not match these losses. The German army in the east was numerically smaller on the 1st of January, 1942, than it had been on the 22nd of June, 1941. It would never again reach its summer 41 strength. The human capital that Germany spent between June and December was, like the engine hours consumed on the road to Kiev, irreplaceable. The army that emerged from the winter crisis was a diminished force, still formidable, still capable of major offensives, but structurally weakened in a way that would become progressively more apparent as the war continued. Hoppner's dismissal deserves specific attention because its consequences extended far beyond the immediate command crisis. The stripping of his rank, pension, and uniform rights was a public humiliation designed to serve as a warning to other commanders who might consider independent action. But it also created a personal grievance of extraordinary intensity. Hoppner would carry this humiliation forward and channel it into the July 20th, 1944 assassination plot against Hitler. He was designated to serve as commander of the replacement army in the event of a successful coup. The seeds of the conspiracy that nearly killed Hitler 3 years later were planted, in part, in the command crises of December 1941. Moscow's aftermath created the bitterness that would eventually detonate in the conference room at the Wolf's Lair. The broader institutional lesson of the December purge is one that extends well beyond the specific context of the German military in 1941. The tension between political authority and professional military judgment, the question of who makes operational decisions in wartime, and what happens when the two sources of authority disagree, remains one of the most contested and consequential issues in civil-military relations. The German case is an extreme example, a political leader who progressively centralized all military decision-making in his own person, dismissing the professionals who disagreed and replacing them with men who wouldn't. But less extreme versions of the same tension appear in every modern military system, from the debates over the Afghanistan withdrawal to the command dynamics in ongoing conflicts. Moscow's lesson is not that political leaders should never overrule their generals. Sometimes the generals are wrong. It is that a system that eliminates the capacity for honest, professional disagreement is a system that has blinded itself. The lines held. This is the fact that matters most, practically, about the winter crisis of 1941-42. Army Group Center did not disintegrate. It did not suffer a Napoleonic-scale catastrophe. The combination of Hitler's halt order, the tenacity of individual German units, the overshoot of the Soviet counteroffensive beyond its own logistical capacity, and the sheer exhaustion of both sides produced a stabilization of the front by late January 1942. The front line settled into a ragged arc, roughly 150 to 250 kilometers west of Moscow, deeper than the German high water mark, but far short of the pre-Barbarossa border. Both sides had fought themselves to exhaustion. The Soviet counteroffensive, having outrun its own supply lines, ground to a halt. The German line, reinforced by the arrival of some replacement units and the consolidation of defensive positions, stiffened. The crisis passed. But the army that survived the crisis was not the army that had begun the campaign. The winter of 1941-42 ended as it had begun, in cold, in exhaustion, in the mutual inability of two battered forces to impose their will on each other. The German army had survived, but survival was not victory. Survival, in the context of a campaign that had been designed to destroy the Soviet Union in a single season, was itself a form of defeat. The Soviet Union still existed. Its industrial base had been evacuated beyond the reach of German forces. Its mobilization system was producing new divisions at a rate the Wehrmacht could not match. The myth of German invincibility, The foundational assumption on which Barbarossa was built was dead, killed not in a single dramatic battle, but in the accumulated weight of logistics failures, mechanical breakdowns, intelligence errors, command disputes, and the stubborn, costly, imperfect resistance of millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians who refused, despite every reason for despair, to stop fighting. Chapter 17, 29 kilometers, What Moscow Means. There is a photograph in the Soviet archives. I have seen reproductions, not the original, showing a German field grave marker somewhere west of Moscow, winter 1941 to 42. The marker is made from a broken rifle stock and a length of wire. A name has been carved into the wood, but in the photograph, the name is illegible, eroded by weather, or blurred by the limitations of the camera, or simply too faintly carved to survive reproduction. It is the grave of a specific man. We cannot read his name. This is what the Battle of Moscow eventually becomes, a story where the evidence survives but the individuals dissolve into statistics, where the weight of aggregate numbers, 830,000 German casualties, 650,000 to 1,280,000 Soviet casualties, crushes the particular into the anonymous. I want to close this story by returning to the question that opened it: why Germany lost the Battle of Moscow, and by admitting, honestly, that the question resists a single answer. The monocausal explanations are seductive. General Winter, the cold stopped them. The Kiev diversion, the 5-week delay cost them the weather window. Hitler's interference, professional military judgment was overruled by political incompetence. Soviet numerical superiority, the Russians simply had more men. Each of these explanations contains truth. None of them, alone, is sufficient. The cold was real, but the army was already logistically broken before the cold arrived. The Kiev diversion consumed critical time, but the logistical deficits would likely have prevented the capture of Moscow, even with those 5 weeks restored. Hitler's command decisions were often poor, but his generals made their own errors and were complicit in the institutional optimism that launched Typhoon with inadequate forces. Soviet numbers mattered, but the counteroffensive succeeded with fewer troops than the Germans fielded. The advantage was in freshness and concentration, not in raw totals. The logistical argument, the argument we began with in the railway yards west of Smolensk, is to me the most fundamental. The 89mm gauge gap, the 18 trains per day instead of 27, the 4,050 missing tons compounding daily. This is the structural foundation on which every other failure was built. You cannot sustain an offensive without supply. You cannot supply an army across 1,000 kilometers of destroyed railway, mud roads, and partisan-infested rear areas with a truck fleet at 40% operational strength. The weather, the command disputes, the intelligence failures, these were accelerants, catalysts, compounding factors. The underlying cause was simpler and more damning. The German military-industrial system was not capable of supporting a campaign of this duration, at this distance, against an enemy of this resilience. The campaign was logistically insolvent from its first months. Everything after that was the slow, painful process of bankruptcy. The strategic argument, the debate over the Kiev diversion, is less clear-cut. The 5 weeks lost to Kiev were probably decisive in terms of the seasonal window, and the mechanical wear on Guderian's Panzer group was unquestionably severe. But the counterfactual, what if Typhoon had launched in late August, runs into the same logistical wall? The railway system was still inadequate. The truck fleet was still deteriorating. The Soviet Union was still mobilizing reserves at a rate that exceeded anything the German planning staffs had anticipated. An earlier Typhoon might have reached the outskirts of Moscow before the Rasputitsa. But reaching the outskirts is not the same as taking the city. And the forces required to take and hold a city of 4 million people, forces that would need to be continuously supplied through a logistical system that was already failing, were not available in August any more than they were in October. Kiev made things worse. But worse was relative to a baseline that was already failing. The moral dimension of the defeat is the one that most histories prefer to elide, and I want to address it directly. The Wehrmacht's treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, the mass starvation, the death marches, the deliberate neglect that killed millions, was not merely a war crime. It was a strategic error. The genocidal conduct of the German occupation stiffened Soviet resistance in ways that no military operation could have achieved. Soviet soldiers who might, under different circumstances, have surrendered or deserted, instead fought with the desperation of men who knew that captivity meant death. Soviet civilians who might have remained passive under occupation, instead supported the partisan movement, provided intelligence to the Red Army, and endured the hardships of the defense with a grim determination that was rooted partly in patriotism and partly in the understanding that the alternative to resisting was annihilation. Germany did not merely fail to take Moscow. It ensured, through its own conduct, that every Soviet citizen had a personal reason to resist. The question of what Moscow means in the broader arc of the Second World War is a question that historians have debated since the guns fell silent, and I don't propose to settle it here. Moscow was not the turning point. Stalingrad, Kursk, the Western Allied campaigns, and the industrial mobilization of the United States all followed, and any of them has a stronger claim to the title of decisive moment. What Moscow was, what it did that nothing before it had done, was kill the foundational assumption on which the entire German war plan rested. That assumption was invincibility. That assumption was that the Wehrmacht, the force that had conquered Poland in 4 weeks and France in 6, could not be stopped by any opponent, in any terrain, under any conditions. After Moscow, that assumption was dead. Every subsequent German offensive, including the initially spectacular advance to Stalingrad in 1942, was conducted in the shadow of the knowledge that the Wehrmacht could be stopped, that it could be pushed backward, that it could be defeated. I have spent months in these archives, and I keep returning to specific details rather than grand conclusions. The unsigned margin annotation, still not enough, on the logistics summary from August. The irregular engine noted beside the Panzer III's serial number. Guderian's incomplete sentence to his wife about losses that exceed all. The coffee stain on the Fourth Army's Rasputitsa report. The factory ledger at Tula with its parallel columns for outgoing production and militia armament. The boring mill on its freight car, 18.7 tons, heading east into the Ural winter. These are the details that, for me, constitute the real history of the Battle of Moscow. Not the grand strategic narratives, not the arrows on maps, not the memoirs of generals with reputations to protect, but the small, specific, unglamorous artifacts of a catastrophe experienced at the level of individual machines, individual documents, and individual human decisions. The defeat at Moscow was not caused by a single error. It was caused by a cascade, logistical, strategic, institutional, technical, and moral, in which each failure compounded every other failure until the aggregate exceeded the capacity of any force, however professionally excellent, to overcome. The persistent search for a single explanation, the winter did it, Hitler did it, the Siberians did it, reveals more about the searcher's need for simple answers than about the history. Simple answers are comforting. They imply that if one variable had been different, if the quartermaster had ordered winter clothing, if Hitler had not diverted to Kiev, if the Rasputitsa had arrived a week later, the outcome would have changed. But the archive suggests otherwise. The archive suggests a system of failure so comprehensive, so deeply embedded in the structure of the German campaign, that no single corrective could have been sufficient. The campaign was insolvent, the offensive was overstretched, the enemy was underestimated, the logistics were impossible, the command was dysfunctional, and the moral framework within which the campaign was conducted, the framework of racial annihilation that transformed every occupied Soviet citizen into an enemy, ensured that resistance would be maximal, surrender would be rare, and the war would be fought to the last. In 2026, the question of why great powers fail in wars of choice continues to generate the same monocausal temptations that plague Moscow historiography. It was the terrain, it was the leadership, it was the supply chain. The lesson of Moscow 1941 is that systemic failure is always multi-causal, always cascading, and always obvious only in retrospect. The factors that produced the German defeat, logistical overextension, institutional hubris, intelligence failure, environmental underestimation, moral bankruptcy, are not unique to the Eastern Front of the Second World War. They are the recurring features of military overreach across centuries and continents. The specific details change. The underlying pattern does not. An army advances beyond its supply capacity, against an enemy it has underestimated, in terrain it doesn't understand, under a command system that cannot process bad news. The result, in 1941, as in every comparable case, is failure. Not sudden and dramatic, but slow, grinding, and cumulative, experienced not as a single moment of defeat, but as a progressive loss of capability that becomes irreversible before anyone in authority is willing to acknowledge it. 29 kilometers. That is the distance between the closest German approach and the center of Moscow. It is the number that every popular history leads with, the number that invites the tantalizing what if, the number that suggests the margin between victory and defeat was razor thin. But I have spent 17 chapters arguing that the margin was not thin at all, that by early December 1941, the gap between what the Wehrmacht needed to achieve and what it was capable of achieving was not 29 kilometers, but an entire system of failure, wide and deep and irreparable. The 29 kilometers are a fact. They are also a distraction from the deeper truth that the Battle of Moscow was decided not in the frozen suburbs of the Soviet capital, but in the railway yards and the transmission casings and the supply depots and the command conferences and the private letters and the factory ledgers and the mobilization orders and the nameless graves marked with broken rifle stocks and illegible names. That is where the history lives. That is where the answers are. And that is where I leave you, not with a conclusion, because the archives don't offer conclusions, only evidence, but with the quiet certainty that the story of why Germany lost the Battle of Moscow is, finally, the story of everything at once. Appendix: the historiographical map debate. 1. Logistics versus weather. What actually stopped the Germans? The General Winter School, rooted in German post-war memoirs, holds that the unprecedented cold of 1941 to 42 was the primary cause of the German failure. The Logistics School, represented by scholars including Martin van Creveld, David Stahel, and others, argues that the Wehrmacht's supply system was already fatally compromised before the cold arrived, and that the autumn Rasputitsa was more operationally damaging than the subsequent frost, because it destroyed the supply network at the moment of the offensive's critical phase. This documentary sides with the Logistics School, while acknowledging that the cold imposed compounding damage on a system already in crisis. The debate appears primarily in chapters 1, 3, 6, and 11. Debate 2. The Kiev diversion. Did it cost Germany Moscow? The Lost Opportunity School argues that the 5-week diversion of Guderian's Panzer Group to Kiev consumed the weather window needed for a successful Moscow offensive. The Structural Impossibility School argues that the Wehrmacht lacked the force and logistical capacity to take Moscow, regardless of timing. This documentary presents the Kiev diversion as a significant accelerant of failure rather than its sole cause. The debate appears primarily in chapters 2 and 17. Debate 3. The Siberian Divisions, Myth or Reality? The popular narrative credits elite Siberian divisions, freed by Richard Sorga's intelligence from Tokyo, with saving Moscow at the last moment. The divisional-level archival analysis shows that only 14 divisions were transferred west after August 1941. Only 4 went anywhere near Moscow, and only 2 had predominantly Siberian personnel. Moscow was saved by mass mobilization across the entire Soviet Union, not by elite transfers from the Far East. This documentary presents the Siberian myth as conclusively debunked by the available evidence. The debate appears primarily in Chapter 10. The Seed and Payoff Index. Seed 1. The 89mm gauge gap, introduced in Chapter 1 as a technical railway fact, returns in Chapter 17 as the structuring metaphor for systemic failure, a tiny measurement with continental consequences. Seed 2. Guderian's private despair, introduced in Chapter 4 through his letters to his wife, pays off in Chapter 16 when his dismissal is recontextualized. The letters prove he knew the offensive was failing, but continued issuing orders, making his relief a more morally complex event than his memoir allows. Seed 3. Soviet soldiers escaping the Vyazma pocket, mentioned in Chapter 5 as a statistical footnote about encirclement porosity, pay off in Chapter 15 when those survivors, reintegrated into reserve armies, form part of the force that launches the December 5th counteroffensive. Seed 4. The shadow factories in the Urals, mentioned in Chapter 9 as a pre-war Soviet contingency, pay off in Chapter 12, when the listener realizes the Matildas are filling a production gap that exists precisely because the evacuated factories haven't restarted. The shadow factory concept explains why the Soviets needed Lend-Lease in late 1941, but wouldn't by 1943. Seed 5. Hoppner's humiliating dismissal, described in Chapter 16 as a punitive personnel action, pays off in the same chapter's concluding observation. The humiliation planted a seed of personal grievance that contributed to Hoppner's participation in the July 20, 1944, assassination plot against Hitler, connecting Moscow's aftermath to the war's endgame.